us reckless, they call us wild, but we're the voice of the unheard child. For too long we've watched them steal and deceive. Now we march, cause in hope we believe. Locked up in chains, they try to make us fall, but we stand tall, we're answering the call. Persecuted, but we won't be tamed. For Mughal freedom, our fire's inflamed. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbound, unbroken by the lights, with Mughal in our hearts. We rise, we rise. The streets are burning with the passion of the brave. No chains can hold us, no power can.
Episode 1, Children of Anger, Echoes of the Fallen by Opebanwo. The hidden sanctuary was aptly named. Tucked away in the dense forests that fringed the outskirts of the capital, it was a place few knew existed, a refuge for those who had no choice but to disappear. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, the canopy above casting the entire area in a perpetual twilight. It was here, far from the prying eyes of the government, that the seeds of the Iguerian movement had taken root. A small group huddled around a makeshift table, their faces shadowed by the dim glow of a single lantern. These were the survivors, the remnants of the End Police movement, now hardened by loss and driven by a burning need for justice. Each of them bore the scars of the past year, some visible, others hidden deep within. But it was in their eyes that the true cost of their struggle could be seen, the cold, steely resolve that comes only from having lost everything. Beside him sat Adora Okoye, a fierce activist whose voice had once rallied thousands to the cause. She was thin, almost gaunt, but her spirit remained unbroken.
Her gaze was fixed on Chuk's Judo 4, waiting for him to speak to give them the direction they so desperately needed.
The others, Aga Adichie, popularly known as Aga Warrior, the tech genius who had kept their communications secure, Aminat Yahaya, the former journalist who had risked her life to tell the truth, and Uche Anozie, the quiet but deadly strategist, sat in silence, their expressions grim.
Each of them had lost friends, family, and loved ones to the brutality of the regime.
And each of them had sworn to see it toppled, no matter the cost.
No matter the cost.
Chinedu Ebubedike cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "We have to be smarter this time," he began, his voice low but firm. "What happened at Union Square can never happen again. We can't afford to lose more lives."
Adora nodded, her voice cutting through the gloom. "We've been underground for too long. The people are losing hope. They need to see us, to know that we're still fighting."
"And we will," Chinedu Ebubedike replied, his eyes locking onto hers. "But we won't make the same mistakes. This time we fight on our terms. We fight in the shadows, where they can't reach us."
Then Adora broke the quiet with a question that had been gnawing at her since the idea of a new movement first took shape. "But what kind of movement are we talking about?" she asked, her tone serious. "Are we going to have a formal leadership structure, or should we remain an informal movement, decentralized and leaderless?"
The room fell into a tense silence as the question hung in the air. It was a critical decision, one that could determine the success or failure of their cause.
"We need leadership," Chinedu Ebubedike said firmly. "The people need someone to look to, a figurehead who can unite them, give them direction. Without leadership, we risk chaos and disorganization. How can we mobilize effectively without a central command?"
Aga Warrior shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "Leadership makes us vulnerable," he countered. "If they know who's in charge, they'll target us. They'll find our leaders, imprison them, kill them if they have to. And once the leadership is gone, the movement could fall apart. A leaderless movement, one where each cell operates independently, is harder to destroy. The soul of the movement can't be compromised if there's no single head to cut off."
Adora nodded thoughtfully. Aga has a point. But without some form of leadership, how do we coordinate our efforts? How do we ensure that we're all working towards the same goal, rather than fragmenting into separate, ineffective groups?
Aminat leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "A leaderless movement has its advantages, but it also means that we lose the ability to inspire the masses. People need a face to rally around, someone who embodies their hopes and dreams. If we're just a collection of cells with no visible leadership, how do we gain the trust of the people? How do we show them that we're more than just a disjointed rebellion?
Uche, ever the strategist, spoke next. There's also the issue of messaging. A centralized leadership can control the narrative, ensure that our message is consistent and powerful. If we go leaderless, we risk losing that cohesion. Different cells might start pushing different agendas and the movement could lose its focus.
But central leadership also brings the risk of corruption, Aga interjected. How many times have we seen movements co-opted by the very system they sought to overthrow? Leaders become targets for bribery, intimidation, and worse. A decentralized movement can't be corrupted in the same way. It's adaptable, flexible, and can survive even if some parts are compromised.
Chinedu Ebubediki sighed, rubbing his temples as the debate grew more heated. Both approaches have their merits, but we can't afford to be divided on this. We need to decide, and we need to be unified in that decision.
The room fell silent once more, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Each of them knew the stakes, understood that there was no perfect solution. The arguments for both sides were compelling, and the choice was far from clear-cut.
After what felt like an eternity, Chinedu Abubadik spoke again, his voice resigned but firm. It's clear that we can't reach a consensus on this. We all want the same thing, a better Mugaland, free from tyranny. But we have different ideas on how to achieve it. So, we move forward with both approaches. Those who believe in a centralized leadership can work together, and those who favor a decentralized, leaderless structure can form their own cells. We'll pursue our goal in our own ways, but with the same ultimate aim.
Adora nodded slowly, though the tension in her expression remained. It's not ideal, but it might be the only way. We'll stay in communication, support each other where we can, but each group will operate independently.
Aga warrior exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Agreed. We'll be harder to stop this way, but we'll need to be more careful. Every cell needs to be disciplined, every action calculated.
Amenat and Uche exchanged glances, then nodded in agreement. The decision had been made, and while it wasn't the clear, unified path they had hoped for, it was the best they could do given their differences.
We all know what's at stake, Chinedu Ebubediki said, his voice steady. We may be taking different paths, but our destination is the same. Mugaland will be free of corrupt and incompetent politicians, and we'll make sure of it, no matter the cost.
The group slowly dispersed, each member lost in their thoughts. The hidden sanctuary, once a place of unity, now felt fractured, the weight of their separate paths heavy on their shoulders. But as they left, the first rays of dawn began to pierce the canopy, casting shafts of light onto the forest floor. It was a new day, and with it came the promise of a new beginning. A day when the blood of the innocents would no longer cry out in vain, but would be the foundation upon which a new Mugaland would rise. The Iguarians were ready even if they were not entirely unified, and they would not be stopped.
Episode 2, Children of Anger, The Spark of Change by Opa. Mugaland, once a beacon of hope and prosperity in the region, had descended into a state of decay. The air in the capital city was thick with the stench of corruption, poverty, and despair, a far cry from the vibrant, bustling metropolis it had once been. The streets were filled with the weary and the disillusioned, citizens who had long since given up on the promises of their leaders. The grand buildings that lined the avenues were now symbols of greed and power, towering over the crumbling infrastructure and the desperate souls who lived in their shadows. For years, the people of Mugaland had watched as their leaders bled the nation dry, enriching themselves while the rest of the country suffered. The gap between the rich and the poor had widened to a chasm, with the elite living in fortified mansions while the masses struggled to survive in overcrowded slums. The once proud institutions of government had become tools of oppression, used to silence dissent and crush any attempt at change. The police, now feared as much as the criminals they were meant to stop, patrolled the streets with an iron fist, their brutality unchecked and their power absolute. Amidst this backdrop of hopelessness, a man named Paul Igwe, a name that would soon be whispered with reverence across the nation, was beginning to see the world with new eyes. A former governor of the Mugaland state of Onitshaara, Paul Igwe was known for his straightforward simplicity, honesty, and prudence with state funds. His tenure as governor had been marked by a commitment to transparency and accountability, values that were all too rare in Mughal political landscape. Under his leadership, Onitshara had experienced a renaissance with significant improvements in education and healthcare, sectors that had long been neglected by previous administrations. Paul's approach to governance was a breath of fresh air in a system that had been suffocating under the weight of corruption for decades. He had slashed unnecessary expenses, redirected funds to vital public services, and held his administration to the highest standards of integrity. But his refusal to play by the established rules of Mughal political elite had made him many enemies. The political establishment despised him for his honesty, viewing his straightforwardness as a threat to their carefully constructed networks of power and influence. Despite his successes, Paul's tenure as governor had been anything but smooth. He had been impeached twice, both times on dubious grounds, as the political establishment sought to remove him from office by any means necessary. Yet, each time he had fought back, taking his case to the people and winning their support. His resilience only deepened the respect and admiration that ordinary citizens had for him, but it also fueled the animosity of those in power. As Paul sat in his modest office overlooking the city, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had always believed in the potential of Mughal, in the power of its people to rise above their circumstances, but the years had taken their toll. He had seen the corruption firsthand, witnessed the way the powerful preyed on the weak, using the nation's resources to line their pockets while the people starved. He had tried to work within the system, to use his influence and resources to make a difference. But every attempt was met with resistance, every effort thwarted by those who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The tipping point came when Paul attended a charity event in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. The event was meant to provide food and medical care to the needy, but as Paul arrived, he saw the true face of Mughal suffering. Hundreds of people, many of them children, were lined up for miles, waiting for a chance to receive the basic necessities of life. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, and the desperation in the air was palpable. As he handed out supplies, a young boy no older than 10 approached him. The boy's clothes were tattered, his frame emaciated, and his eyes filled with a sadness that no child should ever know. "Thank you, sir," the boy said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "My mama says you're a good man. She says you help people like us." Paul knelt down to the boy's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What's your name, young man?" "Chima," the boy replied. "My mama says we're lucky to have people like you, but she also says it won't change nothing." Paul felt a lump form in his throat as he looked into the boy's eyes that had already seen too much of the world's cruelty. "Your mama is a wise woman, Chima, but she's wrong about one thing. We can change things. We just have to try harder." Chima smiled weakly, but there was no joy in it. "I hope you're right, sir." As the boy walked away, Paul felt a deep, burning anger rise within him. He had always believed that change could come through hard work, through persistence and goodwill. But now he saw the truth. The system was rotten to its core, and no amount of charity could fix it. If he wanted to make a real difference, he would have to do more, much more. That night, as Paul sat in his office, the lights of the city flickering outside his window, he made a decision that would change the course of Mughal history. He would no longer stand on the sidelines, no longer play the game by the rules set by corrupt men. He would enter the political arena once again, not as a governor, but as a candidate for the highest office in the land. He would run for president of Mughal, not as a politician, but as a reformer, a disruptor, someone who would tear down the old order and build something new in its place. His decision was met with mixed reactions. While many of his loyal supporters from Onitshara were thrilled at the prospect of him leading the nation, others were skeptical. Paul had always been a man of principle, but the forces arrayed against him were powerful and ruthless. Still, his message of transparent governance, accountability, and social justice resonated deeply with those who had grown weary of the endless cycle of corruption and repression. Paul's candidacy began to gain traction, particularly among the younger generation who had grown up in a Mughal that seemed to offer them little hope for the future. On social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook, his supporters began to rally, using hashtags and organizing online campaigns to spread his message. They saw in Paul a leader who understood their struggles, someone who could bring about the change they so desperately needed. As the election campaign gained momentum, Paul's loyalists, a small but dedicated group, found themselves at the forefront of a burgeoning online movement. They defended him against the government's smear campaigns, countered the propaganda being spread by the state-controlled media, and worked tirelessly to ensure that his message reached as many people as possible. They were relentless, and their efforts did not go unnoticed. The ruling Agadongo Party, sensing the growing threat, intensified its efforts to undermine Paul's campaign. They used every dirty trick in the book: intimidation, bribery, even attempts to disrupt his rallies. But the movement that had begun online was quickly spilling over into the real world, with more and more people joining the cause each day. While Paul had not initially set out to create a movement, one was forming around him nonetheless. The youth, particularly those who had been part of the End Police protests, began to see in Paul a figurehead for their frustrations and aspirations. The connection between Paul's candidacy and the broader dissatisfaction with the ruling party grew stronger, and soon the movement had a name. The press, initially skeptical, began to take notice. In a headline that would later become iconic, one newspaper referred to Paul's supporters as Iguarians, a nod to both his surname and the warrior-like resolve of those who backed him. The name stuck, and what had started as a loose coalition of online activists began to solidify into a powerful political force. Paul Igwe had become the reluctant leader of a movement that was growing by the day. He had not started the Iguarians, but they had found in him a symbol, a rallying point for their hopes and dreams for a better Muguland. The spark had been lit and the flames were spreading. The Iguarians were on the rise, and with Paul Igwe at their center, they were determined to bring about the change that Muguland so desperately needed.
Episode 3. Children of Anger, The Rise of the Iguarians by Opa Banwo. The aftermath of the End Police protests had left Muguland in a state of simmering unrest. The brutal crackdown on the youth, who had dared to demand an end to police brutality and a better future, had only fueled their anger. The government's attempt to silence dissent had backfired spectacularly, igniting a fire that spread across the nation. What began as a protest against a single issue had evolved into a broader movement against the corruption and repression that had plagued Muguland for decades. In the shadows of this growing discontent, a new force was emerging, a force that would soon shake the foundations of Muguland's political establishment. The youth, disillusioned by the empty promises of the ruling Agadongo Party, were searching for a new direction, a new leader who could channel their anger into meaningful change. It was in this turbulent atmosphere that the Iguarians began to take shape. At first, the Iguarians were not a formal movement, but rather a loose network of individuals connected by a shared sense of frustration and a desire for something better. They communicated primarily through social media, where they could organize without fear of immediate repression. Twitter, in particular, became their battleground, a space where they could challenge the narratives being pushed by the state-controlled media and expose the corruption that had become endemic in Muguland. One night, in the midst of this digital rebellion, a Twitter space was created by a group of vocal activists, all of whom had played significant roles in the End Police protests. The topic was clear: who should we rally behind? The virtual room filled quickly, with thousands joining in, eager to hear and contribute to the discussion. The air was electric with anticipation, the sense that a decision made here could change the course of Muguland's future.
All right, everyone. We need to decide who's going to represent us. The elections are coming, and we can't afford to be leaderless. So, let's hear it. Who's our best bet?
A cacophony of voices immediately erupted, the sound of overlapping opinions creating a chaotic symphony of debate. But one voice, louder and more insistent than the rest, cut through the noise.
It's got to be someone who's already shown they're not afraid to stand up to the establishment. Paul Igwe is that man. He's been through the fire, twice impeached, and yet he stood firm. We need someone with that kind of backbone.
But is backbone enough? We're talking about taking on the whole system, not just one state. Paul's honest, sure, but can he handle the pressure on a national scale? This isn't Onitshaara.
A brief silence followed, the weight of Osa's words hanging in the digital air. But Kemi wasn't one to back down easily.
Paul has more than just backbone. He's got a track record. Education and health in Onitshaara were turned around under his watch. He didn't just talk, he delivered. What we need is someone who can do something, not just promise the world.
Dimeji chimed in, trying to steer the conversation. That's true. But we also need to think about how he'll be perceived. Paul isn't exactly young. Can he connect with the youth with us? Or are we going to end up backing someone who can't even tweet properly? A few chuckles echoed through the space, but the point was serious. The youth wanted someone who could understand them, who could speak their language and not just in sound bites.
That's why we're here, isn't it? Look at what we've done already. We've built this movement online. If Paul's going to be our guy, it's up to us to make sure he's speaking to the people where it matters, on the ground and online. We're the ones who can amplify his voice.
The space buzzed with agreement, but it was clear that not everyone was convinced.
Paul's not the only option. There are others who could take on the establishment, maybe even better than Paul. We need to weigh all our options, not just jump on the first decent candidate we see.
But who else has the guts? Who else has already stood up to the Agodongo party and lived to tell the tale? We don't have the luxury of time to groom someone new. Paul's been in the trenches and he's proven he's not for sale.
The argument grew more heated, voices rising as more people joined in, each bringing their own perspective and concerns. The discussion was passionate, intense, at times even contentious. But beneath the disagreements, there was a shared understanding. Whoever they chose, it had to be someone who could stand up to the immense pressure that would come with leading the charge against the deeply entrenched powers of Muguland. After hours of debate, the conversation began to coalesce around a common theme. The youth were tired of politicians who made promises only to betray them. They wanted someone who had shown, time and again, that he wouldn't back down, no matter the cost. Finally, Demeji, sensing the shift in mood, called for a vote. All right, let's do this. If you're for Paul Igwe, let's see it. We need to know if we're ready to rally behind him. The digital hands raised were overwhelming. Paul Igwe, with his history of defying the corrupt establishment, had won their trust. It wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. Looks like we've got our man. Paul Igwe it is. But let's be clear, this is just the beginning. We're the ones who will make sure he's the voice of the people. We've got to be loud, we've got to be organized, and we've got to be relentless. As the Twitter space wound down, the mood shifted from heated debate to determined resolve. The Iguarians, as they were now calling themselves, had found their candidate. And more importantly, they had found their voice. A voice that would not be silenced, no matter what the Agodongo party threw at them. Days later, in a conversation with his inner circle, Paul reflected on the unexpected turn of events.
I didn't start this movement, but it seems they've decided I'm the one to lead it. We have to honor their trust. This isn't just about an election anymore. It's about a future they believe in, a future we owe it to them to fight for.
His advisor, an older man who had been with him since his days as governor, nodded. The youth are behind you now, Paul, but they'll expect you to be more than just a candidate. They'll expect you to be a champion for their cause. Paul looked out the window at the city below, the lights flickering in the distance. The weight of their expectations was heavy, but it was also invigorating. For the first time in a long while, he felt a renewed sense of purpose.
We'll give them a future they can believe in, and we'll do it together as Iguarians.
Episode 4, Children of Anger, the Formation of the Iguarians by Ope Banwo. With the decision to back Paul Igwe made, the next step for the Iguarians was to build a team that could take the movement from online debates to a formidable force in the streets and at the polls. The youth who had championed Paul's candidacy were determined to make sure that this movement wasn't just a flash in the pan. They wanted to ensure it had the depth, strategy and leadership needed to challenge the entrenched powers of Muguland. The first person brought into the fold was Udoka Naji, a brilliant but reclusive political strategist known in insider circles as the Ghost. Udoka had earned his nickname due to his ability to operate from the shadows, crafting intricate plans that often left his adversaries bewildered and defeated. His mind was a labyrinth of political maneuvers, and he had a reputation for being 2 steps ahead of everyone else. Paul had heard of Udoka through mutual contacts, but finding him was another matter entirely. Udoka rarely showed his face, preferring to communicate through encrypted channels, but when he finally agreed to a meeting, it was clear why he had been so highly recommended.
Your enemies think in straight lines, but will move like shadows, strike where they least expect it. They've never faced anything like this before.
Paul nodded, recognizing the steely resolve in Udoka's eyes.
I'm counting on you, Udoka. We can't afford any mistakes.
There won't be any. We'll be ghosts to them, and by the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late.
Next on the list was Bolu Yahaya, a young tech-savvy activist who had been instrumental in the digital mobilization efforts during the End Police protests.
I've always been known for my quick thinking and my ability to turn the tide of public opinion with just a few keystrokes.
Bolu was a master of algorithms, trends, and online communities, and he knew exactly how to harness the power of social media to build a movement. When Paul approached Bolu to join the team, Bolu was hesitant at first.
I had seen too many politicians promise change only to fall into the same patterns of corruption and neglect once they gained power.
But Paul's track record and the authenticity of the Iguarians swayed him.
Social media is our battlefield. We don't have the state-controlled media on our side, but we don't need it. We'll reach the people where they are, on their phones, in their feeds. We'll make sure they can't ignore us.
His plan was simple but effective. Bolu would oversee the digital strategy, creating viral content, organizing online campaigns, and ensuring that the Iguarians' message reached every corner of Muguland. His work would be crucial in rallying the youth and keeping them engaged throughout the campaign. While Udoka and Bolu worked behind the scenes, Adaora Okoye was a known face of the movement on the ground.
I've always been a passionate advocate for social justice.
Adora had been one of the most visible leaders during the End Police protests. Her fiery speeches and tireless efforts to rally support had made her a beloved figure among the youth.
I had always been skeptical of politicians, but Paul Igwe was different. I saw in him a genuine desire to change the system, and I knew that if anyone could challenge the Agadongo party, it would be him.
When she was asked to join the core team, she didn't hesitate.
We need to take this fight to the streets. The youth are ready, they're angry, they're motivated, and they want change. But we have to give them something to believe in. We have to show them that this isn't just another campaign, it's a movement.
Adeora's role was to organize grassroots support, holding rallies, town halls, and community meetings across Muguland. She would be the one to bring the Iguarians out of the digital world and into the physical one, ensuring that their message resonated with people from all walks of life. Finally, there was Tokunbo Olawale, or Tox, as he was known to his millions of followers on social media.
I've built my brand on a mix of humor, sharp social commentary, and a deep connection with my audience.
Tox had been one of the loudest voices during the End Police protests, using his platform to call out injustices and rally support for the cause. When the Iguarians reached out to Tox, they knew they needed someone who could amplify their message and make it resonate with a broader audience. Tox was the perfect choice.
We're not just changing minds, we're changing the culture. We need to make this movement cool, make it something people want to be part of. And we'll do that by staying authentic, by speaking their language.
Tox's role was to create and share content that would go viral, bringing the Iguarians' message to the masses. He would use his influence to shape the narrative, ensuring that the movement stayed in the public eye and continued to grow. With the core team in place, the Iguarians began to take their message to the people. Social media was their primary tool, but they knew that to win, they needed to mobilize on the ground as well. Adeora led the charge, organizing rallies and town halls in cities and villages across Muguland.
The rallies were electric, filled with passionate speeches, music, and the energy of a generation hungry for change.
The youth, who had long felt disconnected from the political process, were drawn to the Iguarians' message of transparency, accountability, and social justice. They came out in droves, ready to be part of something bigger than themselves.
Bolu's digital strategy was in full swing. Every rally, every speech was live-streamed on social media, reaching millions who couldn't be there in person. Hashtags like #Iguarians4Change and #PaulIgwe 2024 trended consistently, keeping the movement at the forefront of the national conversation.
Meanwhile, Udoka, true to his nickname, remained in the background, pulling the strings and ensuring that the campaign stayed one step ahead of the opposition.
He orchestrated surprise visits to key battleground states, coordinated with local leaders to secure their support, and made sure that every move the Iguarians made was calculated for maximum impact.
Tox, on the other hand, kept the movement fresh and engaging.
He hosted Twitter Spaces, posted daily updates, and even created viral challenges that encouraged people to show their support for the movement.
His influence extended beyond politics, making the Iguarians a cultural phenomenon as well as a political one. As the movement grew, so did the opposition's attempts to stop it. The Agadongo party used every trick in the book: smear campaigns, intimidation, even attempts to sabotage rallies, but the Iguarians were resilient. They had the energy, the strategy, and the numbers to push back against every attack.
What started as a loose coalition of disaffected youth had transformed into a well-oiled machine, with a clear mission and a powerful message.
The Iguarians were no longer just a reaction to the government's brutality. They were a full-fledged political force, ready to challenge the status quo and bring about real change in Muguland. And at the center of it all was Paul Igwe, the man who had become the symbol of their struggle. With the core team supporting him, Paul's campaign was gaining momentum, turning the Iguarians from a movement into a revolution.
us reckless, they call us wild, but we're the voice of the unheard child. For too long we've watched them steal and deceive. Now we march, cause in hope we believe. Locked up in chains, they try to make us fall, but we stand tall, we're answering the call. Persecuted, but we won't. They call us reckless, they call us wild, but we're the voice of the unheard child. For too long we've watched them steal and deceive. Now we march, cause in hope we believe. Locked up in chains, they try to make us fall, but we stand tall, we're answering the call. Persecuted, but we won't be tamed. For Mughal freedom, our fires inflame. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unblocked, unbroken by the lights. With Mughal in our hearts, we rise, we rise. The streets are burning with the passion of the brave. No chains can hold us, no power can enslave. They say we're rebels, but we know we're right. Corruption crumbles when we unite. On social media, in the open streets, our voices thunder, refusing defeat. They throw us in cells, accuse us of treason, but we keep fighting, for we are the reason. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbowed, unbroken by the lights. With Mughal in our hearts, we rise, we rise. We fight for the future, we fight for the land. With hearts full of fire, we make our stand. They can't break our spirits, they can't make us fall. In the name of Mughal, we answer the call. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbound, unbroken by the lights. With Mughal in our hearts, we rise, we rise. We are the anger, we are the flame. For the love of Mughal, we'll fight in her name. With unyielding hearts, we'll carry the fight. In the dark of corruption, we'll be the light.
Children of Anger, the agrarian explosion by Ope Banwo. The spark that had ignited the agrarian movement was now spreading like wildfire across the entire nation. What had begun as a few passionate voices on social media had grown into a powerful nationwide movement that transcended traditional political boundaries. The agrarians were no longer just a group of disaffected youths. They had become a force to be reckoned with, shaking the very foundations of Mughal political establishment. In the northern regions of Mughal, where political activity had long been dominated by entrenched elites, the rise of the agrarians took many by surprise. Traditionally conservative and resistant to change, the youth in these areas were galvanized by the message of transparency and justice that Paul Igwe represented. Small groups began to form in cities like Kahana, Kandana, and Maiduguri, where young people who had never before been involved in politics were now meeting in secret, plotting ways to support the movement. One such group, calling themselves Awosa Youth for Change, started as a handful of university students who'd been inspired by the speeches they had seen online. Without any formal structure or funding, they began organizing rallies and distributing flyers, urging their peers to join the movement. Their efforts were fueled by a deep-seated frustration with the status quo, and their numbers grew rapidly. In a makeshift office in Kano, Ahmed, the leader of the group, spoke passionately to his fellow organizers. "We don't need money from anyone to make this happen. The power is in our hands, and if we all chip in, we can make sure the Iguerians are heard loud and clear in the north. Let's show them that we're not just sheep waiting to be led. We're the future of this country." The group set up a GoFundMe page on Twitter, where they began raising money from supporters all over the region. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from students, young professionals, and even a few sympathetic elders who had grown tired of the corruption that had plagued Mughal for decades. The money was used to rent offices, print banners, and organize events. Within weeks, Awassa Youth for Change had established a network of cells across the northern states, each one operating independently but united in their support for Paul Igwe. In the southwestern part of Muguland, the movement took on a life of its own, driven by a group called Mugu Independence Matters. This group, made up of young professionals and activists, had been at the forefront of social justice causes for years. But the rise of the Iguerians gave them a new sense of purpose. The group's leader, Tade, was a lawyer by profession, but his passion lay in activism. He had been following Paul Igwe's career since his days as governor of Onitsha, and he saw in him a candidate who could finally bring the change that Mughal needed. Tade and his team didn't wait for instructions or funding from Paul. They took matters into their own hands. "Paul Igwe isn't just a candidate, he's a symbol of what we can achieve if we come together," Tade told his team during a strategy meeting. "We're not waiting for anyone to save us. We're going to build this movement ourselves." Mugu Independence Matters began by pooling their resources to rent and equip offices across 5 states in the southwest. They bought t-shirts, caps, and other campaign materials, which they distributed to their members, but they didn't stop there. The group also donated 8 buildings to the movement, turning them into community hubs where people could come together, organize, and plan their next steps. The group's efforts attracted hundreds of new members, many of whom had never been involved in politics before. They formed over 100 cell groups, each one operating independently but connected by a shared goal. The movement spread like wildfire through towns and cities, drawing in people from all walks of life who were eager to be part of something bigger than themselves. In the eastern regions of Mughal, where Paul Igwe's influence was already strong due to his roots in Onitsha, the movement exploded with an intensity that caught even the most seasoned politicians off guard. The youth, who had long been disenfranchised by a system that seemed designed to exclude them, saw in Paul a leader who could finally represent their interests. One of the most active groups in the East was Okapob for Igwe, a grassroots organization that sprang up almost overnight. Led by Nkem, a fiery young entrepreneur, the group quickly became known for its bold and innovative strategies. Nkem, who had built a successful business from the ground up, applied the same entrepreneurial spirit to the movement, organizing fundraisers, rallies, and community outreach programs. "Paul Igwe is one of us," Nkem would often say at their meetings. "He understands what it means to struggle, to fight for what's right. We're not waiting for him to tell us what to do. We're going to make sure he has the support he needs to win this fight." The group's efforts were self-funded, with members contributing whatever they could. They organized fundraising dinners, sold merchandise, and even hosted online auctions to raise money for the movement. The funds were used to support their grassroots activities, from renting venues for rallies to printing campaign materials. The energy and enthusiasm were palpable, and it wasn't long before Okapob for Igwe had established a strong presence across the eastern states. But as the Iguerian movement grew, not all who joined were motivated by a desire for change. In both the north and the east, a few unscrupulous individuals saw the movement's popularity as an opportunity for personal gain. These criminally minded people began to exploit the frenzy surrounding Paul Igwe's candidacy, setting up fake fundraising campaigns and collecting donations from unsuspecting supporters, only to disappear with the money. In one instance, a group in the north called Unity for Change claimed to be raising funds for the movement, only for the organizers to vanish after collecting a significant amount of money. The same thing happened in parts of the East, where a couple of fake groups took advantage of the enthusiasm of the Iguarians, collecting donations under false pretenses. These incidents sent shockwaves through the movement, and for a time there was fear that they might undermine everything the Iguarians had worked for. But instead of tearing the movement apart, these betrayals only strengthened the resolve of the true supporters. They doubled down on their efforts to ensure that the movement remained transparent and accountable, setting up online platforms where donations could be tracked and verified. Bolu Yahaya, the tech guru, played a key role in this. He developed a secure online platform where genuine supporters could donate directly to verified groups, ensuring that their contributions were used for the movement and not siphoned off by criminals. "We're not going to let a few bad apples ruin this for everyone," Bolu said during an emergency online meeting with the core team. "This movement is too important. We'll make sure that every kobo goes to the right place, and that the Iguarians know exactly how their money is being used." As the Iguarians continued to grow, the ruling Agadongo party became increasingly alarmed. They had never seen anything like this before, a movement that was not only self-funded but also decentralized, with independent groups springing up all over the country. The fact that these groups were organizing themselves, raising their own funds, and operating without direct orders from Paul Igwe terrified the establishment. They realized that this was a movement they couldn't easily control or suppress. The politicians who had grown fat on corruption and the spoils of power began to plot ways to undermine the Iguarians from within. They planted informants within the groups, spread rumors to sow discord, and tried to co-opt some of the movement's leaders with offers of money and power. But the Iguarians were not easily swayed. They had seen too much, suffered too much, to be bought off by the same people they were fighting against. The ruling party's efforts to destroy the movement only fueled the Iguarians' resolve. They knew that they were on the right path, and that the fear of the establishment was a sign that they were making progress. The more the Agadongo party tried to stop them, the more determined they became to see their mission through to the end. The growth of the Iguarians was nothing short of organized chaos. Groups across the country operated independently, each with its own leadership and strategies, yet all were united in their support for Paul Igwe and their desire for change. This decentralized structure, while chaotic, was also the movement's greatest strength. It made it impossible for the ruling party to target any single leader or group, as the movement was too spread out, too diverse, and too resilient. For the first time in Mugaland's history, a political movement was being funded and driven by the people themselves, without any need for handouts or direction from the candidate they supported. The Iguarians had become a living, breathing force, driven by hope, anger, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of a better future. As the movement continued to grow, the ruling party's fear turned to desperation. They had underestimated the power of the people, and now they were scrambling to find a way to stop the tide that was rising against them. But the Iguarians were unstoppable. They were the voice of a new generation, a generation that was tired of waiting for change and was ready to make it happen on their own terms. And as they marched forward, their numbers growing with each passing day, they knew that they were on the cusp of something truly historic. The Iguarian explosion had begun, and there was no turning back.
The Iguarian movement had grown too powerful to be ignored, and the ruling elites of Mugaland were growing increasingly desperate. The movement's rapid expansion, its self-sufficiency, and its deep connection to the youth of the nation had shaken the foundations of the old guard. The Agadongo party, long accustomed to ruling unchallenged, now faced an opponent that was not only resilient, but seemingly unstoppable. Chief Bisola Elenian, a leading contender in the upcoming election, and a figure known for his ruthlessness, saw the writing on the wall. Nicknamed the Godfather, Chief Elenian had built his empire on a foundation of fear, loyalty, and an extensive network of loyalists, including street thugs who did his dirty work. He knew that if the Iguarians continued to gain momentum, his chances of securing the presidency would be severely threatened. Something had to be done, and it had to be done swiftly. The decision was made to target one of the movement's most visible and vocal leaders, Gabby Tollbearer. Gabby had become a household name after his involvement in the End Police protest, where his speeches and organizing efforts had inspired countless young people to join the cause. He was a natural target, a symbol of the movement's defiance and its determination to bring about change. The plan was simple: eliminate Gabby Tollbearer, and the movement would lose one of its most powerful voices. But Chief Elenian knew that simply arresting Segun wouldn't be enough. The charges needed to be serious, something that would not only discredit him, but also strike fear into the hearts of the Iguarians. It was a warm evening at Onidodo Beach, one of the few places where Gabby could escape the pressures of the movement and spend time with his wife and close friends. The beach was a popular spot in Alaye City, known for its serene views and relaxed atmosphere. On this night, Gabby was laughing, enjoying a rare moment of peace as the waves gently lapped at the shore. But unbeknownst to him, forces were at work to turn his world upside down. Morufu Ika, a notorious street enforcer and one of Chief Elenian's most trusted operatives, had been quietly observing Gabby for weeks. On Chief Elenian's orders, Morufu had planted firearms in the trunk of Gabby's car earlier that day, ensuring that the setup would be airtight. As Gabby and his friends began to pack up for the evening, a convoy of police vehicles suddenly pulled up, their sirens blaring. The beachgoers looked on in shock as the officers, armed to the teeth, surrounded Gabby and his group. "Mr. Gabby Tollbearer," one of the officers barked, stepping forward with a smirk. "You're under arrest for possession of illegal firearms." Gabby's face went pale as the accusations sank in. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice a mixture of confusion and anger. "I don't own any guns." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for his men to search the car. Moments later, they emerged with the weapons that had been planted by Morufu, holding them up for everyone to see. "Explain this then," the officer sneered, holding up a rifle. Gabby's wife, Yewande, cried out in horror, clutching her husband's arm. "This is a setup! You know he didn't do this!" she screamed. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Gabby was handcuffed and roughly shoved into the back of one of the police vehicles. As they drove away, the officers made sure to parade him through the streets, making a public spectacle of his arrest. The message was clear: this was what happened to those who dared to challenge the powers that be. Gabby was taken to a police station in Alay City, where he was thrown into a cell without any formal charges. The conditions were deplorable, filthy, overcrowded, and infested with rats. But the worst was yet to come. That night, as Gabby tried to make sense of what had happened, a group of thugs entered his cell. They were not ordinary prisoners, but men planted by Morufu Ika to deliver a message. Without warning, they began to beat Gabby mercilessly, their fists and boots raining down on him in a brutal assault. "You think you can take down Chief Elenian?" one of them hissed as he drove a fist into Gabby's ribs. "You think the Iguarians will save you? You're nothing!" By the time the beating was over, Gabby was left lying on the cold, dirty floor, barely conscious, his body covered in bruises and cuts. The pain was excruciating, but it was the realization that he was utterly alone, isolated from the movement he had fought so hard to build, that hurt the most. The following morning, Gabby was dragged out of his cell, barely able to stand. He was told that he would be arraigned on charges of illegal gun possession, charges that carried the death penalty under Mughal draconian laws. The news sent shockwaves through the movement, and within hours, the story of Gabby's arrest and the trumped-up charges spread like wildfire on social media. The Iguarians rally. As soon as the news broke, the Iguarians sprang into action. They had always known that the movement would face resistance from the ruling elites, but this was a direct attack on one of their own. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Twitter was flooded with the hashtag #FreeGabby as supporters demanded his release and denounced the charges as a blatant attempt to silence the movement. Within hours, a Twitter space was organized, where thousands of Iguarians gathered to discuss how they could help. "We need to act fast," said Bolu Yahaya, the tech guru, who had become one of the movement's key organizers. "This isn't just about Gabby. It's about all of us. If they can do this to him, they can do it to anyone." During the Twitter space, the Iguarians mobilized with a level of efficiency that left even their most ardent supporters in awe. Funds were raised in record time, over 5 million mugra in just a few hours, to cover Gabby's legal defense and ensure he had the best representation possible. 2 senior advocates of Mughal volunteered their services, and by nightfall, they were already at the police station, demanding to see their client. But the support didn't stop there. Iguarians from across the country began offering their services to keep Gabby's business running while he was incarcerated. From managing his social media accounts to handling logistics for his company, they stepped up in every way they could, determined to show that they would not abandon their own. "Gabby stood up for us," said Kemi, one of the movement's most vocal activists, during the Twitter space. "Now it's our turn to stand up for him. We're not going to let them break us." As the Iguarians continued to rally around Gabby, word of his plight reached the ears of Oba Orisa, one of the most respected traditional rulers in Alaye City. The Oba was known for his wisdom and fairness, and his influence extended far beyond his kingdom. He had remained neutral in the political machinations of Mughal, but the injustice of Gabby's arrest moved him to act. Oba Orisa made a series of discreet phone calls, leveraging his considerable connections to intervene on Gabby's behalf. The Oba's involvement sent shockwaves through the ruling elite, who knew better than to cross him. Within days, the charges against Gabby were quietly dropped, and he was released from custody. When Gabby emerged from the police station, he was a shadow of his former self. His face was swollen, his body covered in bruises and cuts, and he could barely walk. But despite the physical toll, his spirit remained unbroken. He had survived the worst that the ruling elites could throw at him, and he knew that the experience had only strengthened his resolve. As soon as Gabby was released, the Iguarians wasted no time in showing their support. Hundreds of messages flooded his phone, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. The movement's members organized a welcome home rally, where Gabby, despite his injuries, addressed the crowd. "They tried to break me," he said, his voice hoarse but defiant. "They tried to break all of us. But we're still here, and we're not going anywhere. The Iguarians will not be silenced. We will not be intimidated, and we will not stop fighting until we've won the future we deserve." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in a chorus of support for the man who had become a symbol of their struggle. Gabby's ordeal had only served to strengthen the movement, uniting the Iguarians in their determination to see their mission through to the end. As Gabby stood before the crowd, battered but unbowed, it became clear that the ruling elites had made a grave miscalculation. Instead of breaking the movement, they had given it new life, new purpose. The Iguarians had shown that they were willing to stand up for their own, no matter the cost, and that they would not be deterred by fear or intimidation. The ruling elites had drawn blood, but the Iguarians had drawn something far more powerful: solidarity, unity, and an unbreakable spirit. Episode 7, the ruling elites, desperate to quash the growing influence of the Iguarians, realized that brute force alone would not be enough. The movement had proven resilient, with its members rallying together even in the face of arrests, brutality, and intimidation. It was time for a different strategy, one that would sow discord and discredit the movement from within. The elites decided to weaponize the fears and prejudices of Mughal diverse population, turning the country's complex ethnic and political landscape against the Iguarians. The elite's first move was to tie the Iguarians to a figure who had long been a thorn in the government's side: Ogbonna Ibekwe. Ibekwe, a controversial and polarizing leader, had been advocating for the secession of the southeastern regions of Mughal to form a new country called Okorobia Nation. His rhetoric was incendiary, calling for cities to be burned and chaos to reign unless his demands were met. The Agodongo party had previously arrested Ibekwe on charges of treason, and he was currently awaiting trial. Seeing an opportunity to exploit the deep-seated fears of national disintegration, the government's counterattack unit began circulating stories on social media, particularly on Twitter and Facebook. These stories claimed that the Iguarians were secretly controlled by Ibekwe, and that Paul Igwe was nothing more than a puppet being used to further the Okorobian agenda. The narrative suggested that the true goal of the Iguarians was not to reform Mughal, but to tear it apart, leading to the secession of the southeastern states. "Paul Igwe is just a front," read one widely shared post on Twitter. "The real mastermind behind the Iguarians is Ogbonna Ibekwe. Don't be fooled. This is all part of a plan to break up Mughal and create Okorobia Nation." The tweets and posts were carefully crafted to tap into the fears of ordinary Mughalanders, particularly those in the central and northern regions, where the idea of secession was deeply unpopular. Within days, the narrative began to gain traction, with many people questioning the true intentions of the Iguarians. As the false narrative spread, it began to take on a dangerous ethnic dimension. The Yorubawas, one of the largest tribes in the western regions of Mugaland, and the tribe of Chief Bisola Elenian, were particularly susceptible to the government's propaganda. The fear that the Iguarians were part of a secessionist plot played directly into long-standing tensions between the different ethnic groups in Muguland. Leaders within the Yorubawa community, many of whom were aligned with Chief Elenian, began to publicly denounce the Iguarians, accusing members of their own tribe who supported the movement of being traitors. The rhetoric quickly became incendiary, with high-profile figures using their platforms to stoke the flames of division. On CVT TV, a major network controlled by Chief Elenian's allies, a popular talk show host ranted against the Iguarians during a primetime broadcast. "These so-called Iguarians are nothing but a tool of the Okorobians," he declared, pounding his fist on the table. "And any Yorubawa who supports them is a bastard. You're betraying your own people. This is a fight for our survival, and we cannot allow traitors in our midst." The broadcast had an immediate impact. Across the western states, tensions flared as supporters of the Iguarians found themselves ostracized and even attacked by their own communities. The divisions spread like a contagion, infecting even those who had previously been sympathetic to the movement. One of the most dramatic confrontations took place in Alea City, where a group of Yorubawa youths confronted a pro-Iguarian rally. What began as a heated exchange of words quickly escalated into violence, with stones and bottles thrown, and several people injured. "Traitors!" the Yorubawa youths shouted as they charged at the Iguarians. "You're selling us out to the Okorobians!" The clash was captured on video and quickly went viral, further deepening the ethnic divide. The elites watched with satisfaction as the Iguarians' message of unity and reform was drowned out by the roar of tribalism and fear. The response: rallying the base. Despite the intense pressure, the Iguarians refused to back down. They knew that if they didn't act quickly, the movement could be torn apart by the lies and divisions being sown by the ruling elites. In a move of strategic brilliance, Bolu Adebayo, the tech guru, organized a massive Twitter space titled "The Real Truth About the Iguarians." The Twitter space was joined by thousands, including key figures from the movement, such as Paul Igwe himself, and members of the Iguarians from across the country. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a determination to set the record straight. Paul Igwe spoke directly to the accusations for the first time, his voice calm but firm. "Let me be absolutely clear, the Iguarians have no connection to Ogbonna Ibekwe or any secessionist agenda. We are a movement for all Mugalanders, regardless of tribe or region. Our goal is to build a better Mugaland for everyone, not to divide it." His words were met with widespread support, with thousands of listeners tweeting their agreement and solidarity. Kemi, one of the movement's youngest influencers but most vocal activists, with millions of followers on Twitter, also took the stage. "The elites are terrified of us because they know we represent the will of the people. They're trying to divide us because that's the only way they can stop us. But we're smarter than that. We won't let them play us against each other." The Twitter space turned into a rallying cry for the Iguarians, as speakers from across the country shared stories of unity and resistance against the lies being spread by the government. They emphasized that the movement was about fighting for justice and accountability, not about dividing the nation. At the same time, Sunset Television, one of the few media outlets sympathetic to the Iguarians, aired a special program highlighting the movement's efforts to bridge ethnic divides and build a united front for change. The program featured interviews with Iguarians from different tribes, all of whom spoke passionately about their commitment to the movement's goals. "We're not going to let them tear us apart," said Adayora Okoye during her interview on Sunset Television. "The Iguarians are bigger than any one tribe or region. We're fighting for all of Mugaland, and we're not going to let the elite's lies distract us from that." Counterattacks and escalation. Despite the best efforts of the Iguarians to counter the narrative, the divisions continued to grow. The smear campaign had done its job, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that was difficult to dispel. The Yorubawa West and Awosa North regions, both critical in the upcoming elections, saw a significant drop in support for the Iguarians as tribal leaders urged their followers to distance themselves from the movement. However, the Iguarians were not without their victories. In the southeastern states, where the Okorobian narrative had initially caused some unease, the movement managed to reclaim much of its support by emphasizing its commitment to national unity and rejecting any association with Ogbonna Ibekwe. The elites, sensing that their efforts to divide the movement were only partially successful, began to plot their next move. The stakes were higher than ever, and the battle for the future of Mughal was only just beginning. A nation on edge. As the sun set on another tumultuous day in Mughal, it was clear that the country was on the brink. The ruling elites had drawn blood, but the Iguarians had not been defeated. The movement had shown that it could withstand even the most insidious attacks. But the cost had been high. The divisions that had been sown would not easily be healed, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. Yet, for all the fear and uncertainty, there was still hope. The Iguarians had proven that they were more than just a movement. They were a force that could not be easily silenced or broken. As they regrouped and prepared for the next phase of their struggle, they knew that the eyes of the nation were upon them. The battle for the soul of Mughal was far from over, and the Iguarians were ready to fight for their future, no matter the cost. The Iguarian movement had grown exponentially, drawing in supporters from all walks of life, and had begun to solidify as a powerful force in Mughal political landscape. However, not everyone who had been part of the broader struggle for change was on board with the direction the Iguarians were taking. The tension between the Iguarians and the original organizers of the End Police movement, known as the OG End Police leaders, had been simmering for months. These tensions finally came to a head in a series of explosive confrontations, both online and in the public sphere. The End Police movement had originally been a grassroots effort to protest against police brutality, particularly the abuses committed by the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, known as SARS. The protests had united young people across Mughal, cutting across tribal and political lines. However, as the movement evolved, so too did its goals and leadership. The Iguarians, inspired by the momentum of the End Police protests, had channeled that energy into a broader political movement, rallying around Paul Igwe as a candidate for president. This shift didn't sit well with some of the original End Police organizers, who felt that the movement was being co-opted for partisan purposes. Elega Oloyinbo, a prominent voice during the End Police protests and a self-proclaimed Twitter warrior, had been one of the most vocal critics of the Iguarians. Known for his sharp tongue and unapologetic stance on social justice issues, Elega believed that the Iguarians were betraying the original purpose of the End Police movement. During a heated Twitter space titled End Police vs. Iguarians: The Real Agenda, Elega didn't hold back. The End Police movement was about fighting against police brutality and systemic oppression, Elega declared, his voice crackling with intensity. It was never about electing politicians or aligning ourselves with any political party. The Iguarians have twisted our cause into something it was never meant to be, a political tool for their so-called revolution. Esiri Sebi-Sohun, another key figure in the original End Police protests, echoed Elega's sentiments. The Iguarians are a mob, driven by a political agenda that has nothing to do with what we fought for, she said. They're turning our movement into a platform for partisan politics, and that's not what End Police was about. It's a betrayal, plain and simple. The accusation struck a nerve among the Iguarians, who had always prided themselves on being the inheritors of the End Police legacy. They saw themselves as the next evolution of the struggle, taking the fight from the streets to the highest levels of power. To them, the criticism from Elega and Esiri was not only unfair but deeply hypocritical. The Iguarians were quick to respond, and the counterattack was brutal. Bolu Yahaya, the tech guru who had been instrumental in organizing the Iguarians' digital strategy, led the charge on Twitter. It's easy to criticize from the sidelines when you've sold out to the very people we're fighting against, Bolu tweeted, his words dripping with contempt. The OGs claim we're the ones politicizing the movement, but where were they when Chief Elenian started lining their pockets? Silence is complicity. The accusation sent shockwaves through the online community. Bolu and other Iguarians began digging into the past of some of the OG End Police leaders, unearthing evidence that suggested they had been receiving payments from various political figures, including top politicians like Chief Bisola Elenian, for social media services. To the Iguarians, this was nothing short of a betrayal. In a Twitter space organized by the Iguarians titled Exposing the Sellouts, the revelations were laid bare. Let's talk about the so-called leaders who have been bought off, Kemi, one of the movement's most vocal activists, said during the discussion. They were loud when it was convenient, but when the money started flowing, their voices went quiet. They accuse us of hijacking the movement, but they're the ones who sold it out. The Iguarians didn't just stop at Twitter, they took their message to the streets, organizing rallies where they called out the OG police leaders for what they saw as their hypocrisy and betrayal. Banners with slogans like, "End Police was just the beginning" and "Iguarians for True Change" were waved defiantly as speakers urged the crowd to reject the attempts to divide them. The accusations of betrayal were further complicated by the ethnic tensions that had been simmering since the smear campaign linking the Iguarians to the Okorobian secessionist movement. The OG police leaders, many of whom were from the Yorubawa tribe, began framing the Iguarians as an Eastern agenda. Elega Oloyinbo was particularly vocal about this, using his platform to stir up tribal sentiments. "The Iguarians are not about justice or change," he tweeted. "They're about pushing an Eastern agenda, and they're using Paul Igwe as their frontman. Don't be fooled. This is tribalism, plain and simple." The rhetoric sparked a wave of backlash from Iguarians, who accused the OG police leaders of falling into the same tribal jingoism they had once condemned. "You're the ones being tribalistic," Adora Okoye fired back in a televised debate on Sunset Television. "You're using our different tribes to divide us, just like the elites want. This isn't about the East or the West or the North. This is about all of Mugaland. If you can't see that, then maybe it's you who's lost sight of what we're fighting for." The debate quickly became a flashpoint for the broader conflict between the Iguarians and the OG police leaders. On Sunset Television, the hosts allowed the movement's leaders to make their case, giving airtime to their arguments that the OGs had lost their way and were now serving the interests of the very elites they once opposed. On the other side, CVT-TV, the network aligned with Chief Elenian, painted a very different picture. In a special segment titled "The Truth Behind the Iguarians," the network echoed the accusations of the OG police leaders, framing the Iguarians as a dangerous tribalistic mob that had strayed far from the original goals of the police protests. "These Iguarians are nothing but opportunists," one of the CVT-TV hosts declared. "They've hijacked a noble cause and turned it into a political machine. And let's not forget who's pulling the strings, Ogbonna Ibekwe, the secessionist leader. This isn't about change, it's about power, and they'll destroy Mugaland to get it." The segment was widely shared and debated, further polarizing the country and deepening the rift between the Iguarians and the OG police leaders. The fallout from the conflict was immediate and intense. The OG police leaders, feeling the pressure from both the Iguarians and the ruling elites, found themselves increasingly isolated. Their attempts to distance themselves from the Iguarians were seen by many as a betrayal, and their influence began to wane. Meanwhile, the Iguarians, though battered by the attacks, emerged stronger and more unified. They had weathered the storm, but at a cost. The movement was now clearly distinct from the original police protests, with its own goals, leadership, and direction. The break from the OG police leaders was complete, and the Iguarians were determined to prove that they were the true heirs to the fight for justice and change in Mugaland. As the dust settled, one thing was clear: the Iguarians were no longer just a movement. They were a force unto themselves, unshackled by the past and ready to forge their own path forward. The ruling elites had succeeded in driving a wedge between the Iguarians and the original police organizers, but in doing so, they had only created a more determined and focused opponent. The battle for the future of Mugaland was far from over, and the Iguarians, now fully aware of the challenges they faced, were ready to take it to the next level. Episode 9, Trouble in Paradise. The Iguarian movement had grown rapidly, drawing supporters from every corner of Mugaland. With such rapid expansion, however, came the inevitable challenges of maintaining unity and direction. The movement, once characterized by its grassroots spontaneity and decentralized leadership, was now facing its first major internal crisis. What had begun as a unified effort to elect Paul Igwe was beginning to fracture under the weight of ambition, power struggles, and greed. The formation of the Iguarians Coalition. It started innocuously enough. A group of influential Iguarians leaders, each with a large following, came together to form what they called the Iguarians Coalition. The idea was simple. By uniting under one banner, they could present a more organized and powerful front in their advocacy for Paul Igwe. The coalition claimed that this would streamline efforts, prevent duplication of resources, and give the movement more clout in the political arena. However, the coalition also came with a price, literally. They announced that any group wishing to join the coalition would have to pay a membership fee of 500,000 mugra. The money, they argued, was necessary to fund the coalition's operations, including organizing events, creating promotional materials, and running social media campaigns. They also made it clear that any Iguarian group that did not join the coalition would not be recognized as an official part of the movement. The announcement sparked immediate controversy. While some groups were willing to pay the fee, seeing it as a necessary investment in the movement's success, others were outraged. They argued that the very essence of the Iguarians was that it was a people-powered movement, not beholden to any centralized authority or fees. To them, the coalition's demands represented everything they were fighting against: elitism, exclusion, and the monetization of political activism. Internal strife and backlash. One of the most vocal opponents of the coalition was the leader of a prominent Iguarian group called Naija Must Be Free, led by Prince Wankoko. Wankoko, who had been one of the early adopters of the Iguarian cause, had poured his own money into creating a free mobile app that disseminated information about Paul Igwe's campaign, organized events, and kept supporters informed about upcoming activities. He saw the coalition's demands as a betrayal of the movement's principles. "I didn't join this movement to pay my way in," Wankoko said during a fiery Twitter Space debate. "We're here because we believe in Paul Igwe and the change he represents. Now you want to charge us 500,000 mugra just to be recognized? That's not the Iguarian spirit, that's extortion." The response from the coalition was swift and brutal. They banded together to discredit Wankoko, launching a coordinated attack on Twitter and other social media platforms. Coalition members accused him of being a mole for Chief Bisola Elenian, the powerful Yorubawa politician who had long been an enemy of the Iguarians. "He's nothing but an Elenian stooge," tweeted one prominent coalition member at Igwe for Change. "He's trying to divide us from within because he can't stand to see the Iguarians united. Don't be fooled by his fake Naija Must Be Free rhetoric. He's just another pawn in the Godfather's game." The attacks quickly gained momentum, with coalition supporters piling on. They claimed that Wankoko's refusal to join the coalition was proof that he was working against the movement, and they called on all Iguarians to reject his mobile app, accusing it of illegally mining user data. "Don't download the app," warned at True Iguarian. "It's been compromised. Wankoko is using it to steal your data and sell it to the highest bidder. Report it to Google and protect yourselves." The smear campaign was devastatingly effective. Within days, the app, which had been gaining popularity among Iguarians, was inundated with complaints. Over 100,000 reports were filed with Google, claiming the app was unsafe. Despite there being no evidence to support these claims, the sheer volume of complaints forced Google to shut it down, effectively silencing one of the movement's most valuable tools. Feeling betrayed and isolated, Prince Wankoko took his grievances directly to Paul Igwe. In an open letter posted on social media, Wankoko pleaded with the Iguarian leader to intervene. "Dear Paul," the letter began, "I have dedicated my time, resources, and passion to supporting your candidacy because I believe in the change you represent. But now, I find myself under attack, not from our common enemies, but from within our own ranks. The Iguarians coalition has sought to extort money from us, and when we refused, they have done everything in their power to destroy our efforts. I beg you, as the leader of this movement, to step in and restore order. We cannot allow greed and ambition to tear us apart." The letter struck a chord with many within the movement, who were disturbed by the internal strife and the heavy-handed tactics of the coalition. However, to their dismay, Paul Igwe and his campaign team chose to remain silent. Publicly, they maintained an air of neutrality, refusing to take sides in what they portrayed as a minor internal disagreement. In private, however, the campaign team debated the issue extensively. Some advisors argued that Igwe should distance himself from the coalition's tactics to avoid alienating his grassroots base. Others insisted that staying out of the fray was the safest course of action, as intervening might create deeper rifts within the movement. Ultimately, Paul Igwe decided not to involve himself directly. He hoped that by staying above the conflict, he could avoid alienating any faction within the movement. But this decision only served to deepen the resentment among those who felt victimized by the coalition. The Agadongo People's Party and Chief Elenian supporters wasted no time in exploiting the growing divisions within the Iguarians. They launched a campaign of their own, gleefully pointing to the internal strife as evidence that the Iguarians were not the united, principled movement they claimed to be. They talk about change and justice, but look at them. They're already tearing each other apart over money, sneered a commentator on CVT TV during a segment titled, "The True Face of the Iguarians." These so-called reformers are just like the rest, added another panelist. They're driven by greed and power, and they're no different from the elites they claim to oppose. This proves what we've been saying all along. Most of these Iguarians are in it for the money, not for Mugaland. The segment was widely shared, and the narrative began to take hold among the broader population. The Iguarians, who had once been seen as a beacon of hope and integrity, were now being painted as just another group of opportunists, driven by self-interest rather than a genuine desire for change. The fallout from the conflict was severe. The movement, which had prided itself on its inclusivity and grassroots nature, was now fractured. Many smaller Iguarian groups, disillusioned by the coalition's actions and Paul Igwe's refusal to intervene, began to splinter off, choosing to continue their advocacy independently. The Naija Must Be Free group, despite the attacks, continued its work, but without the app and with a significantly reduced online presence. For the first time since its inception, the Iguarian movement seemed vulnerable, not because of external threats, but because of internal discord. The ruling elites, watching from the sidelines, could hardly contain their glee. The once unified front of the Iguarians was now riddled with cracks, and those cracks were growing wider by the day. But even as the movement stumbled, the core of its supporters remained committed. They knew that the fight for Mugaland's future was far from over, and that despite the setbacks, the Iguarians still had a crucial role to play in the upcoming elections. The question was whether they could overcome their internal divisions in time to make a difference. As the movement regrouped, one thing became clear. The road to change was going to be far more difficult and treacherous than anyone had anticipated. The Iguarians had drawn blood, but now, they had to figure out how to heal their own wounds before they could hope to heal the nation. Episode 10, The Children of Anger Face Off with the Grandfather of Violence. The Iguarian movement had become a force to be reckoned with, a symbol of the unyielding determination of a new generation to reshape Mugaland. Their aggressive stance on social media and their refusal to compromise had won them both admiration and resentment. Among those who had grown increasingly critical of their methods was Professor Jade Oripo, a Nobel laureate and once a revered fighter against oppression. Professor Oripo had long been celebrated for his fearless advocacy for justice. In his youth, he had been a radical, a firebrand, who had taken extreme measures to confront tyranny. His legendary status in Mugaland's history was built on his audacity to stand up to power, even when it meant risking his life. However, as the Iguarians grew more assertive in their demands for change, Oripo found himself at odds with the very people who had once looked up to him. The professor's critique, it began with a tweet that sent shockwaves through the Iguarian community. Professor Oripo, known for his eloquent and thoughtful commentary, took to Twitter to express his disapproval of the Iguarians' methods. The Iguarians have become a social media Gestapo, a mob of children of anger who destroy without thinking, he wrote. Their methods, though born out of a desire for change, are dangerous and reckless. They have lost sight of the principles they claim to uphold. For many within the movement, this critique felt like a betrayal. Professor Oripo, a man whose own history was steeped in radical activism, was now condemning them for using the very tactics he had once employed. The Iguarians, however, were not ones to back down from a fight, especially not when they believed they were in the right. Exposing the grandfather's past. It didn't take long for the Iguarians to dig into Professor Oripo's past, unearthing the very stories that had made him a legend. They highlighted the fact that in his youth, Oripo had been far more than just a writer and intellectual. He had been a revolutionary. Years ago, in a bold and dangerous move, a young Jade Oripo had stormed a broadcasting station at gunpoint. Furious over what he believed was a rigged election, he had taken the broadcasters hostage, forcing them to announce the correct election results that had been suppressed by the government. For this act, Oripo was declared a fugitive, and he had to flee to the southeastern region of Mugaland, seeking refuge among the Okorobians, a tribe he now looked upon with disdain. But that wasn't all. During his time on university campuses, Oropo had founded a secret society known as the Road Eagles. This group was dedicated to fighting oppression in all its forms, using whatever means necessary. Under Oropo's leadership, the Road Eagles became notorious for their violent tactics. They burned down the houses of corrupt administrators, severely beat lecturers who exploited students, and instilled fear in anyone who dared to abuse their power. The very violence and anger that Oropo now condemned in the Iguarians had been his weapon of choice in his youth. The Iguarian response. The response from the Iguarians was swift and merciless. They took to Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms calling out Oropo for his hypocrisy. "You talk about children of anger, Professor?" Tweeted at Igwa4Change. "Look in the mirror. You were the original child of anger, the one who taught us that sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. Don't forget, you were the one who stormed a broadcasting station with a gun. You were the one who started the Road Eagles. We're just following in your footsteps." The hashtag #grandfather of anger quickly began to trend, with Iguarians across the country sharing stories of Oropo's past and accusing him of abandoning the principles that had once defined him. In a heated Twitter space titled "The Children of Anger Face Off with Their Grandfather," Iguarian leaders and supporters confronted Oropo's legacy head-on. The debate was intense, with voices on both sides clashing over the interpretation of Oropo's past and its relevance to the current struggle. "Professor Oropo was a hero," began Kemi, one of the movement's most passionate voices. "But heroes can fall. He's forgotten what it means to fight for justice. The anger he once wielded like a sword has turned into bitterness. He should be proud of us for continuing the fight he started." Another participant, Tade, added, "The Road Eagles didn't back down when faced with injustice. They didn't play nice, and neither will we. If Professor Oropo wants to call us children of anger, he should remember that we are his children, following the path he laid out." The clash on Sunset Television. The clash between the Iguarians and Professor Oropo spilled over from social media to mainstream media. On Sunset Television, a special episode of their popular political talk show featured a fiery debate between Iguarian representatives and supporters of Professor Oropo. "The Iguarians are simply the new generation of fighters," argued Bolu Yahaya, representing the movement. "Professor Oropo should be celebrating us, not condemning us. We are doing what he once did, standing up to oppression in the only way the oppressors understand, without fear." On the other side, an older academic who had worked closely with Oropo defended the professor's stance. "There's a difference between fighting for justice and descending into chaos," he said. "What Oropo did in his youth was targeted and purposeful. What the Iguarians are doing now is reckless, and it risks tearing the fabric of our society apart." The discussion grew heated, with neither side willing to concede. The tension in the studio was palpable, and the debate was mirrored across the nation, with households, cafes, and offices buzzing with arguments about who was right. The old guard who preached caution and wisdom, or the new generation who demanded immediate and uncompromising action. The aftermath. The clash between the Iguarians and Professor Oropo marked a turning point in the movement's relationship with the older generation of activists. The debate had exposed the deep rift between those who had once fought for change and those who were now leading the charge. For the Iguarians, the fight with Oropo was not just about defending their methods, it was about asserting their right to define their own struggle, even if it meant challenging the very people who had inspired them. Professor Oropo, for his part, was deeply affected by the backlash. In a follow-up interview with The Observer, he reflected on the controversy. "I have always believed in the power of anger to fuel change," Oropo said, "but anger, unchecked, can also destroy. My concern for the Iguarians is that in their zeal, they may lose sight of the justice they seek. I fought with anger in my youth, yes, but I also learned the value of restraint. I only hope they do the same before it's too late." But the Iguarians were undeterred. For them, the clash with Professor Oropo had only reinforced their belief that their fight was necessary and that they were on the right side of history. They knew that their methods would continue to draw criticism, but they also knew that they could not afford to be anything less than relentless. As the dust settled, the Iguarians stood firm, ready to continue their battle for the soul of Mugaland, even if it meant facing off against the very icons who had once led the way.
They call us reckless, they call us wild, but we're the voice of the unheard child. For too long we've watched them steal and deceive. Now we march, cause in hope we believe. Locked up in chains, they try to make us fall, but we stand tall, we're answering the call. Persecuted, but we won't. They call us reckless, they call us wild, but we're the voice of the unheard child. For too long we've watched them steal and deceive. Now we march, cause in hope we believe. Locked up in chains, they try to make us fall, but we stand tall, we're answering the call. Persecuted, but we won't be tamed. For Mughal freedom, our fire's inflamed. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbowed, unbroken by the lies. With Mughal in our hearts, we rise, we rise. The streets are burning with the passion of the brave. No chains can hold us, no power can enslave. They say we're rebels, but we know we're right. Corruption crumbles when we unite. On social media, in the open streets, our voices thunder, refusing defeat. They throw us in cells, accuse us of treason, but we keep fighting, for we are the reason. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbowed, unbroken by the lights. With Mughal in our hearts, we rise, we rise. We fight for the future, we fight for the land. With hearts full of fire, we make our stand. They can't break our spirits, they can't make us fall. In the name of Mughal, we answer the call. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbound, unbroken by the lights. With Mughal in our hearts, we rise, we rise. We are the anger, we are the flame. For the love of Mughal, we're fighting her name. With unyielding hearts, we'll carry the fight. In the dark of corruption, we'll be the light.
As the Iguarian movement grew in strength and numbers, Paul Igwe, the man at the center of it all, found himself walking a delicate tightrope. After decamping from his original political party, Igwe had joined the Workers' People's Party, a small but passionate party that had long championed the cause of the common people. However, the WPP had never seen anything like the Iguarians, a massive, vocal, and self-funding group of supporters who were fiercely loyal to Igwe and relentless in their pursuit of a better Mughal. What should have been a natural alliance quickly turned into a tenuous and fragile relationship. The WPP, which had always struggled to gain a foothold on the national stage, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight thanks to Igwe's popularity and the Iguarians' fervent support. But rather than embrace this newfound energy, the party's leadership found themselves wary of the Iguarians, unsure of how to manage this powerful but unpredictable force. The Workers' People's Party had never had a leader with the national stature of Paul Igwe. For years, the party had languished on the fringes of Mughal political scene, advocating for workers' rights and social justice but never truly breaking through to the mainstream. Igwe's arrival should have been a game-changer, but instead, it created anxiety within the party's ranks. The party's leaders, most of whom were old-school politicians who had built their careers on grassroots organizing and traditional political tactics, were unprepared for the digital dynamism that the Iguarians brought to the table. The party had never dealt with such a large, tech-savvy and vocal group of supporters, and their response was cautious, perhaps overly so. Instead of integrating the Iguarians into the party structure, the WPP kept them at arm's length. The party leadership saw the Iguarians not as allies but as a potential threat to their control. They feared that the movement's energy and loyalty to Igwe might eclipse the party itself, reducing the WPP to nothing more than a vehicle for Igwe's ambitions. At the same time, the party's leadership struggled to keep up with the rapid pace of the digital age. While the Iguarians were organizing Twitter spaces, launching viral hashtags, and creating powerful online campaigns, the WPP's responses were slow, clunky, and often out of touch. The disconnect between the tech-savvy Iguarians and the party's old-school leadership became increasingly apparent, and tensions began to rise. For the Iguarians, the WPP's reluctance to fully embrace them was frustrating. They had poured their time, energy, and money into supporting Paul Igwe, and they saw the WPP's slow responses and cautious approach as a drag on their candidate's momentum. The Iguarians were used to moving fast, making decisions on the fly, and taking bold actions. The WPP's old-fashioned ways felt like a ball and chain, holding them back from achieving their goals. "Why are we even bothering with them?" asked Kemi during a heated Twitter space discussion. "The party is stuck in the past. We're the future. Our loyalty is to Paul Igwe, not to a bunch of politicians who can't even figure out how to use Twitter." This sentiment was echoed by many within the movement. The Iguarians began to publicly criticize the WPP, calling out its leaders for being out of touch and out of date. They accused the party of being a hindrance to Igwe's campaign, rather than an asset. One particularly explosive incident occurred when the WPP issued a statement criticizing the Iguarians for their unruly behavior and calling for a more disciplined approach to political advocacy. The statement was met with immediate backlash. "Unruly? We're the ones doing the work," tweeted at Igwe warriors. "While they sit in their offices, we're out here fighting for change. If they can't keep up, maybe they should step aside." The conflict played out across social media, with Iguarians and WPP leaders trading barbs in a very public and very messy dispute. The WPP's attempts to assert control over the movement only fueled the Iguarians' anger, and soon the two sides were locked in a bitter struggle for dominance. As the conflict dragged on, a new and more troubling question began to emerge among the more cerebral and reflective members of the Iguarians. If Paul Igwe couldn't manage this conflict between his supporters and his party, how could he be expected to lead an entire nation? "I believe in Paul Igwe, but this isn't a good look," said Prince Wankoko in a Twitter space titled "Leadership in Crisis." Wankoko, who had already faced his own battles within the movement, was one of the few who dared to publicly question Igwe's leadership. He needs to step in and resolve this. If he can't, then maybe he's not the leader we thought he was. Others agreed, pointing out that Igwe's silence on the matter was damaging not only to the movement but to his credibility as a leader. The Iguarians had always prided themselves on their loyalty to Igwe, but now, for the first time, that loyalty was being tested. "Where is Igwe?" tweeted at Real Iguarian. "We're out here fighting for him and he's nowhere to be found. Leadership means stepping up when it matters. We need him to take control or we risk losing everything we've worked for." As the internal skirmishes between the Iguarians and the WPP escalated, the Agadongo People's Party and Chief Bisola Elenian supporters saw an opportunity to exploit the situation. They began circulating stories that painted the Iguarians as a disorganized and self-serving group, driven more by internal power struggles than by any real commitment to change. "See what we've been saying all along?" sneered a commentator on CVT TV during a segment titled "The Iguarians' True Colors." "They claim to be fighting for a better Mugaland, but look at them. They can't even work with their own party. This isn't a movement for change, it's a power grab by people who are only in it for themselves." The narrative gained traction, particularly among undecided voters who were already wary of the Iguarians' aggressive tactics. The conflict with the WPP was not just an internal issue, it was becoming a public relations disaster, threatening to undermine everything the movement had achieved. In the end, Paul Igwe chose not to intervene decisively in the conflict. Whether out of a desire to avoid alienating either side, or simply out of a reluctance to wade into the messy dynamics of the dispute, Igwe remained largely silent. His refusal to take a firm stance left many within the movement disillusioned. For the Iguarians, the lack of leadership was a bitter pill to swallow. They had dedicated themselves to Igwe, believing him to be the leader who could bring about real change. But as the conflict dragged on, it became increasingly clear that Igwe's hands-off approach was costing them dearly. The tension between the Iguarians and the Workers' People's Party never fully resolved. While the movement continued to push forward, the rift left scars that would not easily heal. And for the first time, doubts about Paul Igwe's ability to lead Muguland began to take root within the very movement that had propelled him to the forefront of the nation's political landscape. As the elections loomed ever closer, the Iguarians faced the daunting challenge of keeping their movement intact while navigating the complex and often treacherous waters of party politics. The question on everyone's mind was whether they could overcome these internal divisions in time, or whether the very forces that had driven them to the brink of power would ultimately be their undoing.
Episode 12, Muguwood, shakes as the Iguarians split the industry. The rise of the Iguarian movement had sparked a cultural and political revolution across Muguland. As the nation wrestled with questions of justice, equity, and the future of its democracy, the impact of the movement reverberated far beyond the traditional political sphere. One of the most significant and unexpected battlegrounds became Muguwood, the nation's vibrant film and music industry. Muguwood had always been more than just entertainment. It was a reflection of Muguland's soul, a mirror held up to society. But as the Iguarians clashed with the ruling elite, the industry found itself torn apart, with actors, directors, musicians, and producers forced to take sides in a growing class war that would define the nation's future. The Iguarian stars. Two of Muguwood's biggest stars, Femi Falomo and Amaka Bradshaw, became unlikely but passionate champions of the Iguarian cause. Femi, a charismatic and influential actor known for his powerful roles in dramas that tackled social issues, saw in the Iguarians the same spirit of resistance and change that had inspired his best performances. Amaka, a beloved actress and singer with a reputation for her advocacy on women's rights, was drawn to the movement's fierce independence and commitment to justice. Femi and Amaka became vocal supporters of Paul Igwe, using their platforms to amplify the Iguarians' message. Their involvement brought a new level of visibility to the movement, drawing in other artists who had previously remained on the sidelines. For them, supporting the Iguarians was more than just a political stance, it was a moral imperative. "I've played heroes on screen," Femi said during an interview on Sunset Television. "But this is real life. We're fighting for the soul of our country, and we can't sit this one out. The Iguarians are demanding the change we've all been waiting for. How can we not stand with them?" Amaka echoed his sentiments during a performance at a benefit concert for the movement. "We sing about freedom, we act out stories of justice, but now it's time to live those values. The Iguarians aren't just talking about change, they're making it happen, and we're going to stand with them every step of the way." Their passionate support galvanized the artistic community, leading to a wave of endorsements from other Muguwood stars, musicians, and even directors. The Iguarians were no longer just a political movement, they were becoming a cultural phenomenon. The counterattack. Chief Elenian's envelopes. Chief Bisola Elenian and his supporters, recognizing the influence of Muguwood, decided to strike back. They began distributing large envelopes of money to some of the industry's biggest names, urging them to publicly endorse Elenian and denounce the Iguarians. The offer was tempting: fame, fortune, and favor with one of the most powerful men in Muguland. Soon, several top-tier actors and musicians who had previously remained neutral or silent began to emerge as vocal supporters of Chief Elenian. These endorsements were plastered across billboards, social media, and television screens, presenting Elenian as the candidate of stability and tradition. One of the most prominent voices in Elenian's camp was Tokay Isaac, a superstar actress known for her glamorous roles and larger-than-life persona. Tokay Isaac, who had long been a darling of the Muguwood scene, took to the airwaves to declare her support for Chief Elenian. "I believe in continuity, in experience," Tokay Isaac said during an interview on CVT-TV, a network known for its pro-Elenian stance. "Chief Elenian represents the values that have kept Muguland strong. We need a leader who understands the complexities of our nation, not a group of unruly activists who want to tear everything down." The endorsements from Muguwood's elite created a stark divide within the industry, with some artists aligning themselves with the establishment and others with the Iguarians. The split was more than just political. It was personal, as friendships and professional relationships were strained or broken. The Iguarians strike back. The Iguarians, true to form, did not take the endorsements of Elenian lying down. They saw the involvement of these Mugawood stars as a betrayal of the very ideals that the industry had often portrayed in its films and music: justice, equality, and the fight against oppression. On social media, the Iguarians launched a relentless campaign against the pro-Elenian artists, calling for boycotts of their movies and music. Hashtags like #boycott the sellouts and #no to oppression trended as Iguarians organized petitions against the artists who had taken Elenian's money. One of the most significant targets of this campaign was Tokay Isaac. The Iguarians accused her of selling out for money and turning her back on the people who had made her a star. They took their campaign global, petitioning platforms like Amazon Prime Video and Netflix to remove her films, arguing that she was using her influence to support a corrupt regime. The pressure worked. Within weeks, Amazon Prime Video announced that it was pulling one of Tokay Isaac's latest films from its platform, citing the overwhelming number of petitions it had received. The news sent shockwaves through Mugawood and was seen as a major victory for the Iguarians. The breakdown. The backlash against Tokay Isaac reached a boiling point when she appeared on a live television interview, where she broke down in tears, describing the harassment she had endured from Iguarians. "I don't understand why they're doing this to me," she said, her voice trembling. "I've always supported the arts, supported our culture. But now, because I have a different opinion, they're trying to destroy my career, my life. This isn't the Mugaland I know." The interview, meant to garner sympathy, only deepened the divide. While some viewers felt pity for Tokay Isaac, others saw her tears as crocodile tears, an attempt to play the victim after choosing to align with the very forces of oppression the Iguarians were fighting against. On Twitter, the response was brutal. "She can cry all she wants," tweeted @IgweWarriors. "But we're not going to let her sell out our country for her own gain. If you stand with Elenian or the Agadongo Party, then you stand with corruption. Period." The fallout from the campaign against Tokay Isaac and other pro-Elenian artists sent ripples through Mugawood. Some artists, fearing similar backlash, began to distance themselves from the political fray, while others doubled down on their support for Elenian, determined to stand their ground. A nation forced to choose sides. As the drama unfolded, it became clear that the upcoming election was not just about politics. It was a battle for the soul of Mugaland. Mugawood, like every other sector of society, was being forced to choose sides, and the stakes had never been higher. The split within Mugawood mirrored the broader divisions within the country. On one side were those who believed in the status quo, who feared the chaos and uncertainty that the Iguarians might bring. On the other were those who saw the Iguarians as the only hope for true change, even if that change came with risks. For Paul Igwe and the Iguarians, the battle within Mugawood was both a blessing and a curse. The support from artists like Femi Falomo and Amaka Bradshaw gave the movement cultural credibility and a platform to reach millions. But the backlash for their stance against the pro-Elenian stars also showed the potential dangers of the Iguarians' uncompromising approach. As the election approached, the tension within Mugawood and within Mugaland as a whole continued to escalate. The nation was on edge, and every tweet, every interview, every petition felt like a battle in a larger war for the future. The question on everyone's mind was simple but profound. When the dust settled, what kind of Mugaland would be left standing?
Episode 13. The Silencing of Chukwudifu Iwubiko. As the Iguarian movement continued to surge, their influence reached every corner of Mugaland, shaking the nation's political and cultural foundations. The battle for control of the country's future was not only being fought in the streets and on social media, but it also spilled into Mugawood, where the lines between entertainment and politics blurred in ways never seen before. One of the most dramatic and polarizing incidents of this cultural clash centered around Yinka Obatoyinbo, a former darling of Mugaland's youth who had fallen from grace after aligning herself with Chief Bisola Elenian's campaign. What followed was a tense and surreal confrontation that highlighted the lengths to which the Iguarians were willing to go to defend their vision for the nation. The fall of Yinka Obotoyinbo. Yinka Obotoyinbo had been a Mugawood superstar, a beloved actress and singer whose work resonated deeply with the youth of Mugaland. Her movies and songs often carried themes of rebellion, empowerment and social justice, making her a symbol of hope for many. But as the election approached, Yinka made a decision that would forever change her legacy. She accepted a lucrative offer from Chief Bisola Elenian's camp, endorsing his candidacy and turning her back on the Igwerians. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Yinka, once hailed as a voice of the people, became the target of relentless trolling and public condemnation. Her social media accounts were flooded with accusations of betrayal, and she found herself increasingly isolated from the very fans who had once idolized her. "Yinka, you were our hero," tweeted at Igwe4Change. "How could you sell out to the likes of Elenian? You've betrayed everything you once stood for, and we won't forgive you." Yinka tried to weather the storm, but as the attacks grew more personal and more vicious, she began to unravel. The Igwerians, known for their unyielding determination, singled her out as a symbol of everything they opposed: corruption, betrayal, and the complicity of the elite. The arrest of Chukwudifu Iwubiko. Among Yinka's most vocal critics was Chukwudifu Iwubiko, a young Igwerian who had made a name for himself as a sharp-tongued commentator on social media. Chukwudifu's critiques of Yinka were particularly biting, accusing her of selling out her people for money and favor with the elites. "You've gone from being a star to a puppet," Chukwudifu tweeted at Yinka. "How much did Elenian pay you to betray the youth? You're nothing but a tool in the hands of the oppressors." Yinka, already on edge from the relentless trolling, rather than dissolving into tears like Tokay before her, decided to use her influence to strike back. Leveraging her connections within the Elenian camp, she pressured the authorities to take action against Chukwudifu. In a move that shocked the Igwerian community, Chukwudifu was arrested at his home in Alaye City, charged with social media terrorism and criminal stalking. The arrest sparked immediate outrage among the Igwerians. Chukwudifu was a popular figure within the movement, known for his fearless critiques and his willingness to speak truth to power. The news of his arrest spread like wildfire, and within hours the hashtag #FreeChukwudifu was trending across Mugaland. "This is a blatant abuse of power," tweeted at Igwe youth. "They can't silence us by throwing us in jail. Chukwudifu was only speaking the truth, and now they want to lock him up for it. We won't stand for this." But the worst was yet to come. While in custody, Chukwudifu was brutally beaten by prison guards, a clear message from those in power that dissent would not be tolerated. By the time he was released, his body was covered in bruises, his spirit battered but unbroken. The charges against him, absurd and politically motivated, were still pending. But the physical and psychological toll of his imprisonment was undeniable. When Chukwudifu was finally able to speak out, he did so with a defiance that only fueled the Igwerians' anger. "They tried to break me," he said in a video posted online. His face was swollen, his voice shaky but resolute. "But they don't understand. We're not going to stop. We're not going to back down. The more they try to silence us, the louder we'll become." The protest at Yinka's movie premiere. The tension between the Igwerians and Yinka Obotoyinbo reached its climax on the night of her much-anticipated movie premiere. Yinka's latest film, The Spirit and the Angel, was supposed to be a crowning achievement in her career, a celebration of her talent and success. But the Igwerians had other plans. As the red carpet was rolled out and the elite of Mugawood gathered at the Grand Cinema in Alaye City, a large group of Igwerians descended on the venue, carrying placards and chanting slogans against Yinka. They blocked the roads leading to the cinema, effectively shutting down access and causing chaos among the guests. "Sell out," one of the placards read. "Yinka Obotoyinbo, puppet of the oppressors." The protest was surreal, a stark contrast to the glitz and glamour of the premiere. As the guests arrived, they were met with angry chants and a wall of determined Igwerians who refused to let the event go on as planned. The disruption was so effective that the premiere quickly turned into a disaster. Guests were unable to enter the cinema, and those who did were met with a nearly empty theatre. The press, which had come to cover the premiere, instead focused on the chaos outside, capturing images of the protest that would soon go viral. Yinka, who had been inside preparing for the event, was informed of the situation and rushed to the scene, only to be met with the full force of the Iguerians' anger. The premiere, which was supposed to be a celebration, had turned into a public relations nightmare. The film, which had been expected to be a blockbuster, flopped before it even had a chance to succeed. The breakdown. The relentless pressure from the Iguerians, coupled with the failure of her premiere, took a severe toll on Yinka Obertoyinbo, just like it did to Tokay Isaac before her, though she had sworn she would never end up like others like her, who had allowed the Iguerians to break their resolve. She had expected backlash and thought she was ready to fight fire with fire, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer intensity of the campaign against her. Every day she was bombarded with hateful messages, her every move scrutinized and criticized. Her social media accounts were flooded with accusations, threats and calls for her to be cancelled. The breaking point eventually came during a live television interview on CVT TV, where Yinka was supposed to discuss her new film. Instead, she found herself facing a barrage of questions about her involvement in Chukwudifu's arrest and the ongoing protests. "Why did you feel the need to use your influence to have Chukwudifu arrested?" the host asked pointedly. "Do you think it was appropriate to take such drastic action against a critic?" Yinka, already emotionally drained, broke down in tears on live television. "I didn't want this," she sobbed. "I just wanted to make a difference, to support someone I believed in. But now everything's falling apart. The hate, the threats, it's too much. I'm just trying to survive in this crazy world." Her breakdown was both poignant and polarizing. While some viewers felt sympathy for her, others saw it as a sign of weakness, a confirmation that she had lost her way. On Twitter, the Iguerians were unforgiving. "Crying on TV won't save her now," tweeted at Real Iguerian. "She made her bed, now she has to lie in it. We won't stop until every one of these sellouts is held accountable." A nation on the edge. The events surrounding Chukwudifu's arrest and Yinka Obertoyinbo's public breakdown marked a turning point in the election campaign. The divide within Mugawood mirrored the broader divisions in Muguland, with the upcoming election becoming a referendum not just on who would lead the country, but on the very future of the nation. For the Iguerians, Chukwudifu's ordeal was a stark reminder of the lengths to which the establishment would go to maintain its grip on power. But it was also a rallying cry, a symbol of their resistance and their determination to keep fighting no matter the cost. As the election drew closer, the tension in the air was palpable. Muguland was on the edge, with every protest, every tweet, every interview feeling like another step closer to a tipping point. The Iguerians were more determined than ever to see their fight through to the end, but they knew that the battle ahead would be their hardest yet. In the streets, on social media, and in the halls of power, the fight for Muguland's soul raged on, with no end in sight.
Episode 14, A Global Movement, A Billionaire's Laugh. The final stretch of the election campaign had begun, and the Iguerian movement was in full swing. Across Muguland and the diaspora, supporters of Paul Igwe were rallying with unprecedented passion, determined to see their candidate through to victory. What had started as a grassroots movement had grown into a global phenomenon, with Mugulanders from all corners of the world opening their wallets to fund Igwe's run for the presidency. It was a spectacle that had never been seen before in the nation's history, a show of collective will that seemed capable of moving mountains. But as the Iguerians raised their banners and shouted their slogans, the forces of Chief Bisola Elenian watched with bemusement, confident that in the end the raw power of money would trump the idealism of youth. The global fundraising frenzy. Paul Igwe, despite his personal wealth, was known for his frugality. A billionaire in his own right, Igwe was not the type to pour his own money into a campaign. His tight-fisted approach was well known, and it became clear early on that if his campaign was to succeed, it would need to rely on the support of his followers, particularly the Muguland diaspora, who had long been a source of financial backing for political movements back home. Recognizing the need to fund their candidate's final push, the Iguerians in the diaspora sprang into action. Led by a group of passionate supporters in Germany, they organized a series of high-profile fundraising dinners across the globe. These events, held in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Dallas, Berlin, London, and others, became the heart of the Iguerian campaign's financial engine. In San Francisco, a $5,000 a plate dinner was hosted by a group of tech entrepreneurs who believed in Igue's vision for a modernized Muguland. The event was a resounding success, with speeches, music, and a palpable sense of excitement in the air. "We're here because we believe in Paul Igwe," one of the hosts declared as he addressed the room. "This is our chance to make history, to give Muguland the leader it deserves." Similar scenes played out in Los Angeles, where the city's Muguland diaspora gathered at an exclusive venue overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The night was filled with optimism and hope as donors pledged their support and wrote checks for the campaign. In Atlanta, a $1,000 a plate dinner saw a turnout that exceeded all expectations, with attendees packing the ballroom and raising over $1 million in a single evening. The European diaspora was no less enthusiastic. In Berlin, a power-packed fundraiser drew Mugulanders from across the continent, who opened their wallets and gave generously to the Iguerian cause. The event, which featured speeches from prominent Iguerian leaders and performances by well-known Muguland artists, was a resounding success, raising millions of dollars for the campaign. As the weeks went on, the fundraising tour continued, with similar events held in cities like Dallas, Nebraska, Florida, and London. By the end of the 6-week tour, the Iguerians had raised an impressive sum of money, enough, they believed, to give their candidate a fighting chance against the well-funded machinery of Chief Elenian. The scoffs of the Elenian camp. But while the Iguerians were celebrating their success, Chief Elenian and his inner circle were watching with a mix of amusement and condescension. Elenian, the king of money as he was known in some circles, was a man who understood the power of wealth better than anyone. To him and his supporters, the efforts of the Iguerians were admirable but ultimately futile. Children playing at a game meant for adults. One morning, as Elenian and his closest advisors sat down for breakfast at his sprawling estate in LA City, the conversation turned to the Iguerian fundraising efforts. "They think they can give us a run for our money," one of his advisors remarked, barely concealing his laughter. "All those dinners, all that effort, and they still can't touch what we've got in the war chest." Elenian, sipping his coffee, smiled knowingly. "Let them have their fun," he said. "When the time comes, we'll roll out the bullion vans, and all that money they raised won't even match up to what I've set aside for a single day." The room erupted in laughter, the sound of it echoing through the halls of Elenian's mansion. They all knew that when the moment of truth arrived, the sheer weight of Elenian's financial power would crush whatever the Iguerians could muster. The quiet cocktail party. While the Iguerians were hosting elaborate dinners and public fundraisers, Chief Elenian preferred a more subtle approach. He reached out to a select group of industrialists and bankers men who owed him favors and who understood the stakes of the upcoming election. Elenian knew that these were the true power brokers of Muguland, the ones who could make or break a campaign with a single stroke of the pen. In a quiet, understated cocktail party held at a private club in Kings Island, LA City, Elenian gathered these influential figures. There was no fanfare, no speeches, no music, just a room filled with some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country, all of whom had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. As the evening progressed, Elenian made his case, not with grand gestures or impassioned pleas, but with the calm, assured demeanor of a man who knew he held all the cards. By the end of the night, he had raised 20 times what the Iguerians had managed to gather in 6 weeks of international fundraising. One of the attendees, a billionaire industrialist, quietly wrote a check for an amount that exceeded the total raised by the entire Iguerian diaspora. It was a reminder, if anyone needed, that in Muguland money still ruled supreme. A Twitter space of hope and despair. As the news of Elenian's effortless fundraising success began to trickle through social media and the news channels, the mood within the Iguerian camp grew somber. The excitement and hope that had fueled the global fundraising campaign were quickly overshadowed by a sense of dismay. For weeks they had worked tirelessly, pouring their hearts and souls into raising money for Igue's campaign, only to be outmatched in a single evening of quiet cocktails and whispered deals. In response to the growing unease, a group of Iguarians called an emergency Twitter space titled Hope versus Reality, the Money War. The virtual room filled quickly, with hundreds of supporters joining in, eager to discuss what many were beginning to see as a bleak situation. The mood was heavy as the conversation began. "I can't believe it," one Iguarian lamented. "All those dinners, all those events. It feels like it was all for nothing. How can we compete with this kind of money? They've been stealing from us for years, and now they're using our own resources against us." Another voice echoed the sentiment. "It's discouraging. We've given everything we have and it still feels like it's not enough. What more can we do?" Space grew quiet as the weight of reality sank in. But then, a brave voice broke the silence. "This isn't about money," the speaker declared passionately. "It's not about the size of the dog in the fight, but the fight in the dog. Come election night, Iguarians will roll out all over the country, and we will bury our enemies at the polls with our votes. We don't need to be paid or collect money to vote. We don't need money to show up and be polling agents. This time money won't matter." His words sparked a flicker of hope among the listeners. "He's right," someone else chimed in. "We're not in this for the money. We're in this because we believe in something better. Let them have their billions. We have the people on our side. That's worth more than all the money in Mugulan." The mood began to shift, with more voices joining in, rallying around the idea that their cause was just and that their determination could overcome the odds. But then, a sneering voice interrupted the momentum. An Elenian supporter had snuck into the space, and his words dripped with disdain. "You really think you can win without money?" he taunted. "I'm sure half of you don't even have voters' cards. On election day, most of you will be busy watching Premier League games instead of voting. You're all unemployed jokers with nothing better to do than go on Twitter and talk nonsense." The reaction was immediate and furious. "Get out of here, you sellout," someone shouted. "You're the one talking nonsense. We'll see who's laughing on election day." The Elenian supporter continued to heckle, but the host quickly muted him and removed him from the room. The interruption had been jarring, but it also served as a reminder of what they were up against, a well-oiled machine with deep pockets and a deep disdain for the people. As the space continued, the Iguarians doubled down on their resolve. "They can mock us all they want," one speaker said, "but we're not giving up. We've come too far to turn back now. This is our fight, and we're going to see it through to the end." The futility of it all. As news of Elenian's fundraising success began to filter out, the mood within the Iguarian camp grew tense. They had worked tirelessly, pouring their hearts and souls into the campaign, only to realize that their efforts might not be enough. The Iguarians had raised millions, but Elenian and his backers had raised billions. For the rich and powerful of Muguland, the choice was clear. Paul Igwe represented change, and change was something they could not afford. To them, supporting Elenian was not about love or loyalty. It was about self-preservation. The lavish lifestyles, the unchecked power, the exploitation of the nation's resources, all of it was at risk if Igwe won. And so, they rallied around Elenian, not because they believed in him, but because they knew that if he lost, the buffet they had been enjoying at Muguland's expense would come to an abrupt end. As the election drew closer, the Iguarians continued to fight, determined to make their voices heard. But in the back of their minds, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were Saul facing Goliath, that no matter how hard they fought, the system was rigged against them. The global fundraising effort was unprecedented, a testament to the power of collective action and the belief that change was possible. But as the final days of the campaign approached, the Iguarians knew that they were up against forces far more entrenched and far more powerful than they had ever imagined. In the end, it was a story as old as Muguland itself, a story of idealism clashing with the harsh realities of power, of hope battling against the weight of money. And as the election loomed, the Iguarians prepared for the final showdown, knowing that no matter the outcome, they had already made history.
Episode 15, The Power of the People and the GoFundMe debacle. As the final days of the election campaign approached, the Iguarian movement's determination to see Paul Igwe elected was palpable. Despite the daunting financial gap between them and Chief Elenian, the Iguarians refused to give up. They had poured their hearts and souls into fundraising dinners, rallies and social media campaigns, rallying support from Mughal-landers at home and abroad. But as the stakes grew higher, it became clear that they needed to harness the full power of the global community, particularly the Mughal-land diaspora, who had long played a crucial role in supporting the fight for a better future. A new call to action. The idea came from one of the major Iguarian support groups, a collective of activists known as Mughal-land United for Change. They had been instrumental in organizing fundraising dinners and rallies, but now they were looking for a way to reach even more people, to tap into the latent power of the global Mughal-land community. One of the group's leaders, a savvy tech entrepreneur named Amanat Yahaya, suggested launching a crowdfunding campaign on GoFundMe. "We need to make it easy for people to support us," Amanat said during a strategy meeting. "Not everyone can attend a dinner or write a big check, but everyone can contribute something. If we can get enough people to chip in, we can raise millions." The idea was met with enthusiasm. The Iguarians had already seen the power of social media in mobilizing support, and they knew that GoFundMe could provide a platform to reach even more people. Within hours, the campaign was set up and a tweet was sent out to announce the launch. "Join us in making history. Support Paul Igwe and the Iguarian movement by donating to our GoFundMe campaign. Every dollar counts. #Iguarians. For Change #PeoplePower read the tweet, accompanied by a link to the GoFundMe page. The response was immediate. Within minutes, donations began to pour in as Iguarians and supporters from around the world opened their wallets to support the cause. The campaign went viral, spreading across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and WhatsApp as people shared the link and encouraged their friends and family to contribute. A global movement. What happened next was nothing short of extraordinary. The GoFundMe campaign quickly gained traction, raising thousands of dollars within the first few hours. Donations came from every corner of the globe: London, New York, Berlin, Dubai, Toronto, Sydney, each contribution a testament to the reach and influence of the Iguarian movement. The campaign resonated particularly strongly with the Mughal-land diaspora, who saw it as an opportunity to contribute to the future of their homeland. For many, supporting the campaign was a way to stay connected to their roots, to be a part of the struggle for a better Mughal-land, even if they were thousands of miles away. One touching aspect of the campaign was the involvement of the children of the Mughal-land diaspora. Young people who had never set foot in Mughal-land but who felt a deep connection to the land of their parents and grandparents. Inspired by the stories of their elders and the vision of the Iguarians, these young people donated their pocket money, held bake sales and organised community fundraisers, all to support Paul Igwe and the cause of change. "Even though I've never been to Mughal-land, I feel like I'm a part of it," tweeted a young girl from Toronto, sharing a picture of herself holding a sign that read, "Support Igwe, support change." "My parents always talk about how beautiful it is and how much better it could be. I want to help make it better." Stories like hers spread across social media as people shared photos and messages of support, each one adding to the growing sense of unity and purpose that defined the Iguarian movement. The $1 million milestone. As the days passed, the donations continued to pour in. What started as a modest campaign quickly ballooned into a massive fundraising effort, surpassing all expectations. Within a week, the GoFundMe campaign had raised over $1 million, a milestone that was celebrated with joy and pride by Iguarians everywhere. The success of the campaign was a testament to the power of the people. It showed that despite the vast financial resources of Chief Elenian and his backers, the Iguarians could still hold their own, leveraging the collective strength of their global community. "We did it," Amanat Yahaya announced in a Twitter space celebrating the milestone. "This is what people power looks like. We may not have the billionaires, but we have something even more powerful: each other. Together we can make history. Together we can change Mughal-land." A thorn in Elenian's side. The success of the GoFundMe campaign did not go unnoticed by Chief Elenian and his inner circle. They had watched with bemusement as the Iguarians organised fundraising dinners and rallies, confident that their financial might would ultimately prevail. But the sight of the GoFundMe campaign with its millions of dollars raised from ordinary people around the world, was a reminder that they could not afford to underestimate the power of the Iguarians. At a meeting of Elenian's top advisors, the discussion turned to the GoFundMe campaign. "These Iguarians are proving to be a thorn in our side," one advisor remarked, tapping his fingers on the table. "We expected them to be loud, but this is something else." Elenian, ever the pragmatist, waved a dismissive hand. "Let them have their money," he said. "It's a drop in the ocean compared to what we have. When the time comes, we'll outspend them at every turn. The real power isn't in a GoFundMe page, it's in the connections, the favors, the networks. That's where we hold the real power." His advisors nodded in agreement, but there was a sense of unease in the room. The Iguarians had shown that they could mobilize resources on a scale that no one had expected, and the prospect of facing a motivated, well-funded opposition was not something they could afford to take lightly. The Twitter space hope versus despair. In the wake of the GoFundMe campaign's success, the Iguarians gathered for another Twitter space, this time to celebrate and reflect on what they had achieved. The mood was jubilant, with speakers expressing their pride and gratitude for the support they had received. "This is incredible," one Iguarian said. "We've raised more money than we ever thought possible. This just goes to show that when people come together, there's nothing we can't do." But amid the celebration, there was also a sense of unease. The reality of the financial disparity between the Iguarians and Elenians' camp was still stark, and some worried that their efforts might not be enough. "Let's be real," another speaker said, his voice tinged with concern. "We've raised a lot of money, but it's still a fraction of what Elenian has. How do we compete with that? How do we make sure our voices are heard?" For a moment, the space fell silent as the weight of the question hung in the air. Then, a familiar voice broke the silence. Chukwudiffu Iwubiko, recently released from his ordeal in prison, spoke up with the passion that had made him a beloved figure among the Iguarians. "It's not about money," Chukwudiffu declared. "It's not about the size of the dog, but size of the fight in the dog. Come election night, Iguarians will roll out all over the country, and we will bury our enemies at the polls with our votes. We don't need to be paid or collect money to vote. We don't need money to show up and be polling agents. This time, money won't matter." His words were met with applause and cheers, as the Iguarians rallied around the idea that their commitment and passion could overcome any obstacle. But the moment was interrupted by a sneering voice. An Elenian supporter had sneaked into the space, and his mocking tone cut through the excitement. "You really think you can win without money?" he taunted. "I'm sure half of you don't even have voters' cards. On election day, most of you will be busy watching Premier League games instead of voting. You're all unemployed jokers with nothing better to do than go on Twitter and talk nonsense." The response was immediate and furious. "Get out of here, you sellout," someone shouted. "You're the one talking nonsense. We'll see who's laughing on election day." The Elenian supporter continued to heckle, but the host quickly muted him and removed him from the room. The interruption had been jarring, but it also served as a reminder of what they were up against, a well-oiled machine with deep pockets and a deep disdain for the people.
Episode 16, The Million Man March in 100 Cities. As the election loomed ever closer, the Iguarians knew they needed to make a powerful statement, one that would resonate across Muguland and send a clear message to the ruling elites. They had organized fundraising dinners, launched a global GoFundMe campaign, and taken their fight to the streets and social media. But now, they needed something bigger, something that would capture the imagination of the entire nation. The idea came from a grassroots meeting in a Leh city, where a group of young Iguarians discussed the need to show their strength in numbers. "What if we organize a million-man march?" one of them suggested. "But not just in one city, in every major city across Muguland. Let's show them that we're not just a movement online, but a force in the streets." The idea electrified the room. Within minutes, plans were being made, tweets were being drafted, and phone calls were being made to Iguarian cells across the country. The Million Man March for Paul Igwe was born. Rallying the movement, the call went out across Twitter, Facebook and WhatsApp. On Saturday, we march. 1 million strong in every major city across Mugaland. This is our time to show the world that we are united, that we are unstoppable. #Million Man March for Igwe, #Iguerians Unite. The response was overwhelming. Iguerians from all walks of life, from every corner of the country, pledged their support. They organized themselves into local groups, holding meetings in homes, cafes and public spaces to plan their marches. Those with resources offered to provide food, water and transportation for their fellow marchers. The energy was infectious, as the movement that had started online prepared to make its presence felt in the physical world. In the days leading up to the march, the excitement reached fever pitch. Iguerians posted pictures of their preparations on social media. Homemade signs, t-shirts with slogans like "Igwe for the people and change we believe in," and boxes of bottled water and snacks to sustain them during the long hours on the streets. "This is going to be historic," one Iguerian tweeted. "We're not just talking about change, we're making it happen. Get ready, Mugaland, the Iguerians are coming." The day of the march. The morning of the Million Man March dawned with a sense of anticipation in the air. From Alaye city to Buja metropolis, from Kano to Port Harcourt and from Enugu to Ibadan, the streets of Mugaland's major cities began to fill with people. The Iguerians, dressed in their bright colors and waving flags, were a sea of hope and determination. In Alaye city, the heart of the movement, the crowd began to gather at dawn. By mid-morning, the streets were packed with tens of thousands of people, all marching in unison, chanting slogans of support for Paul Igwe. The atmosphere was electric, filled with the sound of drums, whistles, and the joyous shouts of the marchers. Amanat Yahaya, one of the key organizers, walked at the front of the march, leading chants of "Igwe, Igwe, Igwe." She carried a large banner that read, "For a better Mugaland, vote Igwe." As she walked, she turned to those around her, her voice filled with emotion. "This is what change looks like," she said. "Look around you. This is our future." All around her, people nodded in agreement, their faces alight with the hope that this march, this moment, could be the catalyst for the change they so desperately wanted. In Buja metropolis, the capital, the scene was much the same. The marchers moved through the city with purpose, their numbers swelling as the day went on. Young people, many of whom had never been politically active before, joined the march, drawn by the energy and the sense of belonging that the Iguerian movement offered. "It's incredible," said Chinedu Ebubedik, one of the marchers. "I've never seen anything like this in my life. We're all here because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. We believe in Igwe and we believe in Mugaland." In Kano, the marchers brought a festive atmosphere to the streets, with traditional drummers and dancers leading the way. The sound of their music filled the air, creating a sense of unity and celebration. "We are one Mugaland," a speaker at the march declared, "and today we show that we stand together for the future of our nation." A stunned nation. As the day wore on, the scale of the marches became clear. Across the country, in over 100 cities, millions of Iguerians had taken to the streets. The images and videos flooded social media, showing the sheer size and energy of the movement. It was a display of grassroots power unlike anything Mugaland had ever seen. On television screens and in newspapers, the marches dominated the news cycle. Commentators, many of whom had been skeptical of the Iguerians' ability to mobilize offline, were stunned by the turnout. "This is unprecedented," one analyst said on Sunset Television. "We've never seen a political movement of this scale in Mugaland. The Iguerians have shown that they are a force to be reckoned with." Even Chief Elenian and his advisors, who had long dismissed the Iguerians as a noisy but ultimately inconsequential group, were taken aback by the sheer numbers. "They're everywhere," one advisor said, watching the footage on a screen in Elenian's mansion. "This isn't just a few angry youths on Twitter, this is something much bigger." Elenian, for the first time, showed a flicker of concern. "We'll see if they can turn out like this on election day," he muttered. But the bravado in his voice was tinged with doubt. A joyous, peaceful revolution. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Million Man March was its peaceful nature. Despite the vast numbers of people, the marches were largely free of violence or disruption. Instead, the streets were filled with music, laughter, and a sense of community that transcended the usual divisions of tribe, religion, and class. The Iguerians provided for each other, sharing food and drinks and looking out for those who needed help. At every march, there were the volunteers handing out bottled water, snacks and first aid supplies. "We're all in this together," one volunteer said as she passed out sandwiches to the marchers. "This is about more than just a candidate. This is about building a better Mughal for all of us." In city after city, the same scene played out. People coming together, supporting each other and standing up for what they believed in. The marches were not just political rallies, they were celebrations of hope, unity and the possibility of change. "This is the Mughal I want to see," said Aga Adichie, popularly known as Aga Warrior, as he marched in Enugu. "A Mughal where we stand together, where we take care of each other, where we fight for a better future." Today, we showed the world what we're capable of. The power of the people. As the sun began to set and the marches started to wind down, there was a sense of accomplishment in the air. The Iguarians had set out to show their strength, and they had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Across Mughal, in every major city, the people had come out in force, showing their support for Paul Igwe and the movement he represented. For the Iguarians, the Million-Man March was more than just a show of support. It was a statement of intent. It was a declaration that they would not be silenced, that they would not be ignored, and that they were ready to fight for the future of their country. "This is just the beginning," Aminat Yahya said as she addressed the crowd in Alaye city. "Today we marched, tomorrow we vote, and when we do we will change Mughal forever." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the streets. The energy, the hope, the determination, it was all there in the faces of the millions who had come together for a single purpose. As the Iguarians prepared to head home, they knew that they had done something extraordinary. They had shown that they were not just a movement online, but a real, powerful force in the streets. And as they looked ahead to Election Day, they carried with them the belief that they could and would make history.
They call us reckless, they call us wild, but we're the voice of the unheard child. For too long we've watched them steal and deceive. Now we march, cause in hope we believe. Locked up in chains, they try to make us fall, but we stand tall, we're answering the call. Persecuted, but we won't. They call us reckless, they call us wild, but we're the voice of the unheard child. For too long we've watched them steal and deceive. Now we march, cause in hope we believe. Locked up in chains, they try to make us fall, but we stand tall, we're answering the call. Persecuted, but we won't be tamed. For Mughal freedom, our fire's inflamed. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbowed, unbroken by the lies. With Mughal in our hearts, we rise, we rise. The streets are burning with the passion of the brave. No chains can hold us, no power can enslave. They say we're rebels, but we know we're right. Corruption crumbles when we unite. On social media, in the open streets, our voices thunder, refusing defeat. They throw us in cells, accuse us of treason, but we keep fighting, for we are the reason. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbowed, unbroken by the lights. With Mughal in our hearts, we rise, we rise. We fight for the future, we fight for the land. With hearts full of fire, we make our stand. They can't break our spirits, they can't make us fall. In the name of Mughal, we answer the call. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbound, unbroken by the lights. With Mughal in our hearts, we rise, we rise. We are the end. flame. For the love of Mughal, we'll fight in her name. With unyielding hearts, we'll carry the fight. In the dark of corruption, we'll be the light.
In the dimly lit room of an undisclosed mansion in the heart of Buja metropolis, the most powerful men in Mughal gathered under the cloak of secrecy. This was not a meeting of a single political party, but an assembly of the nation's most influential power brokers, corrupt politicians, industrialists, and financiers who had long benefited from the status quo. They had come together for one reason: the growing threat of the Iguarians, and the possibility of Paul Igwe winning the upcoming election. The Iguarian movement, with its grassroots energy and mass mobilization, had grown far beyond what anyone had expected. The Million Man March, the global fundraising efforts, the relentless social media campaigns, these were not the actions of a mere fringe group. They were the actions of a movement that had captured the imagination of the people and threatened to upend the balance of power in Mughal. For these power brokers, this was a crisis. They had spent decades building and maintaining their control over the country's political and economic systems. The thought of losing that control to a candidate like Paul Igwe, who promised to return power to the people, was unacceptable. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming," Elenian began, his voice low but commanding. "I trust you understand the gravity of our situation. The Iguarians have grown stronger than we anticipated. Their influence is spreading, and Paul Igwe is gaining ground. If we do not act now, we risk losing everything we have built." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The men present were no strangers to power, and they knew what was at stake. Each of them had benefited from the system of patronage, corruption, and control that had defined Mughal politics for decades. The idea of that system being dismantled was unthinkable. "So what do you propose, Chief?" asked Alhaji Musa Bello, a powerful businessman with deep ties to both the government and the military. "We can't just sit here and watch as these children take over." Elenian leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We destroy them, from within and without. We turn their strengths into weaknesses, and we make sure they crumble before they can gain any more ground. We do whatever it takes to neutralize the Iguarians and make sure Igwe never sees the inside of the presidential palace." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I have thought of several strategies, and I believe that if we implement them swiftly and effectively, we can turn the tide in our favor." The room fell silent, each man waiting for Elenian to reveal his plan. After a moment, he began to outline the strategies that would become the foundation of their campaign against the Iguarians. Strategy 1: Infiltration and misinformation. "The first strategy," Elenian said, "is infiltration. We need to plant our people within the Iguarian movement. We'll use them to spread misinformation, sow discord, and create divisions. The Iguarians pride themselves on being a leaderless movement, but that also makes them vulnerable to internal strife. We will exploit that." A man in a tailored suit, known as Chief Kalu, nodded. "We can use social media to amplify these divisions," he suggested. "Create fake accounts, spread rumors about corruption within their ranks, and pit different factions against each other. If they start fighting among themselves, they won't have time to focus on the election." Elenian nodded approvingly. "Exactly. We'll make them question their own leaders, turn them against each other. If we can create enough chaos, the movement will implode from within." Strategy 2: Financial sabotage. "The second strategy is financial sabotage," Elenian continued. "The Iguarians have been raising money through GoFundMe and other grassroots efforts. We need to cut off their funding. We have connections in the banking sector. We can freeze accounts, launch investigations, and make it impossible for them to access the funds they need to run their campaign." Alhaji Bello leaned forward, a calculating smile on his lips. "I know some people in the central bank who can help with that. We can start by flagging their accounts for suspicious activity, then move on to more aggressive tactics if necessary. Without money, their campaign will grind to a halt." Strategy 3: Legal and political pressure. "The third strategy is to use the legal system against them," Elenian said. "We can have key Iguarian leaders arrested on trumped-up charges, use the courts to tie them up in legal battles, and smear their reputations. We control the judiciary, and we can use it to our advantage. A senator sitting at the far end of the table spoke up. I have contacts in the police force and the judiciary. We can easily arrange for some high-profile arrests, make it look like the Iguarians are involved in illegal activities, paint them as criminals. It will undermine their support. Elenian nodded. And we'll use the media to amplify these stories. Make sure every news outlet is running headlines about Iguarian corruption and criminality. We'll create a narrative that they are a threat to the nation's stability. The fourth strategy, Elenian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, is direct intimidation. We've tried to avoid it so far, but desperate times call for desperate measures. We will use force to silence the most vocal and influential Iguarians. Make them fear for their safety, their families. If we can't buy them, we'll scare them into submission. The room grew tense as the weight of Elenian's words sank in. This was a dangerous path, one that could easily spiral out of control. But the men in the room knew that they had little choice. The stakes were too high, the risks too great. Al-Haji Bello was the first to speak. I have some contacts in the military. We can use them to apply pressure where needed. Make some examples of the more troublesome Iguarians. Once they see the consequences of their actions, the rest will fall in line. Elenian nodded, satisfied. Good. We must be ruthless. We must show them that we will not tolerate dissent. The Iguarians have had their fun, but now it's time for the grown-ups to take back control. The fifth and perhaps most subtle strategy, Elenian said, a cunning smile spreading across his face, is to co-opt known youth leaders and respected commentators on social media. These individuals will pretend to be neutral, claiming that they want change just as much as the Iguarians do. But their real job will be to discredit the Iguarians from within. Chief Kalu raised an eyebrow. How do we do that without making it obvious? Elenian chuckled. We'll recruit individuals who already have a large following, people who are seen as voices of reason. They'll start by agreeing with some of the Iguarians' points, gaining their trust. Then, they'll begin to criticize not Igwe himself, but the movement. They'll say the Iguarians are not about real change but about chaos. They'll amplify every small mistake, every misstep, and turn it into a narrative of instability. Al-Haji Bello nodded in approval. I know a few people who fit that profile. They're always looking for a way to increase their influence, and if we make it worth their while, they'll gladly play along. We need to be strategic about this, Elenian added. These voices will be our undercover agents in the battle for public opinion. They'll cast doubt on the Iguarians' intentions, make people believe that supporting Igwe is not the solution, but the problem. By the time they're done, the Iguarians will be seen as nothing more than a group of misguided agitators, not the future leaders of Muguland. As Elenian finished outlining the fifth strategy, a low voice spoke from the other end of the table. It was Chief Obina, an old politician with decades of experience in Muguland's power circles. He had been listening quietly, his face expressionless, but now he leaned forward, his eyes reflecting a thoughtful concern. I must speak out against this, Chief Obina said, his voice steady but firm. All these plans to demoralize the Iguarians, to destroy them, it may backfire on us. We are dealing with youths, yes, but these are not ordinary youths. They are passionate, they are connected, and they are angry. If we go after them like this, we risk strengthening their resolve instead of weakening it. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Elenian's eyes narrowed as he regarded Obina. And what do you suggest, Chief? He asked coldly. That we do nothing? Obina shook his head. No, but we must be wise. These Iguarians are like a storm. If we resist them head-on, we will only intensify their rage. But if we let them blow, they will eventually lose their momentum. They are young, they will get tired. And traditionally, these youths do not even come out to vote. We should pretend they are not rattling us. Sooner or later, they will fizzle out. By attacking them, we may inadvertently give them the martyrdom they crave, making them stronger than ever. Elenian's face darkened. So you would have us do nothing? No, Obina replied, his voice calm. I would have us be patient. Let them march, let them shout. But let us not give them the satisfaction of thinking they have shaken us. If we remain calm, we will outlast them. The storm will pass and we will still be here standing strong. A murmur of discontent rippled through the room. Al-Haji Bello sneered. You sound like you've already been swayed by their rhetoric, Obina. Perhaps you're not as loyal to our cause as we thought. I am loyal to Muguland, Obina shot back, his voice rising, and I am loyal to the preservation of our power. But I warn you, attacking the Iguarians may be a grave mistake. Elenian's voice cut through the room like a knife. Enough! Obina, you are either with us or against us. This is not the time for half measures or hesitation. The Iguarians are a threat, and we will deal with them as we see fit. If you cannot commit to that, then perhaps you should excuse yourself from this table. The room fell silent once more, the tension thick and suffocating. Obina met Elenian's gaze, his eyes filled with a silent defiance. But he knew better than to push further. With a resigned nod, he sat back, his dissent noted, but ultimately dismissed. As the meeting drew to a close, the men around the table pledged their support to the plan. They were bound together by their shared interests, their fear of losing power, and their willingness to do whatever it took to maintain their grip on the country. They were men of influence, men of wealth, and men of ambition. They were the gatekeepers of Mughal, and they would not be displaced by a group of idealistic upstarts. Remember, Elenian said as he rose to his feet, this is a fight for our survival. The Iguarians think they can change Mughal, but they are wrong. We are the ones who hold the keys to this country's future, and we will not let anyone take that away from us. The room erupted in applause, the sound of it echoing through the mansion's halls. The pact had been made, the strategies agreed upon. The power brokers of Mughal had declared war on the Iguarians, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to win. As they left the mansion, each man knew that the coming days would be critical. The election was just around the corner, and the future of Mughal hung in the balance. The Iguarians had shown their strength, but now it was time for the men of the night to show theirs. And so, under the cover of darkness, the power brokers of Mughal set their plans in motion, determined to crush the Iguarian movement and ensure that the power remained firmly in their hands. The plan was simple in its execution, yet devastating in its potential impact. Infiltrate the Iguarians, get close to their leaders, and gather enough information to dismantle the movement from within. It was the first of 5 strategies the power brokers of Mughal had agreed upon in their secret conclave, and it was set in motion with cold precision. The first step, buy off a few key players, individuals already embedded in the Iguarian movement, known for their activism, and who, with the right incentives, could be turned against the very cause they once supported. It was a rainy night in New York City when the plan began to unfold. In a luxury penthouse overlooking the glittering skyline, 3 prominent Iguarians had been invited to a private meeting. All of them were based in the United States and had become rising stars within the movement, known for their tireless advocacy on social media, their leadership in organizing protests, and their involvement in diaspora fundraising efforts. Each of them had received the same cryptic invitation. Join us for an important discussion about the future of Mughal. Your voice is essential. The message had come from a man they all knew to be connected to influential figures back home, though his exact role in the election had remained shadowy. The 3 activists arrived at the penthouse, intrigued but wary. The air was thick with anticipation as they entered the opulent space, where they were greeted by a sharply dressed man with a warm smile and an expensive watch. His name was Bayo Oluwadare, a well-connected businessman with ties to Chief Bisola Elenian's inner circle. "Welcome," Bayo said smoothly, gesturing for them to take a seat around a glass table. "We have much to discuss." The activists, Chuks Jadeofor, a software engineer turned activist, Ngozi, a vocal advocate for youth empowerment, and Ibrahim, a financial analyst who had been instrumental in the Iguarian fundraising efforts, sat down, their eyes scanning the room with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Bayo wasted no time getting to the point. "You've all done remarkable work for the Iguarian movement," he began, his voice measured and calm. "Your leadership has been noticed, not just by your fellow Iguarians, but by those of us who are looking for the real future leaders of Mughal." The 3 exchanged glances. They had been flattered before, praised for their efforts, but something about the way Bayo spoke felt different. This was not just admiration, it was the prelude to something else. "We believe," Bayo continued, leaning forward slightly, "that your influence within the movement can be elevated. You've already made a name for yourselves, but with the right support, you could be at the forefront of this movement, leading it, shaping it, and making decisions that will impact the future of Mughal." Ibrahim frowned. "What do you mean by support?" Bayo smiled. "Let's not pretend. We know that even the most passionate movements need resources to thrive. We're prepared to provide those resources, financial backing, connections, access to platforms that will amplify your voices, everything you need to become indispensable to the Iguarian cause. Chuck's Judeo shifted uncomfortably in his seat. And what would you expect from us in return? There was a brief pause before Bayo answered. All we ask is that you share with us what's happening within the movement, the plans, the strategies, the key players behind the scenes. Think of it as a mutual exchange of information. You help us understand the pulse of the Iguarians, and we help you rise within their ranks. Ngozi's expression hardened. So, you want us to be spies? Traitors? Bayo's smile didn't falter. No, not traitors. Realists. You see, the Iguarians are destined to fail without proper guidance. They're disorganized, too idealistic. But with your help, we can steer them in the right direction. You'll be heroes in the long run. He leaned back, letting his words sink in before delivering the final blow. And of course, there's a financial incentive. Each of you will be compensated for your efforts, handsomely. As he spoke, 3 envelopes were slid across the table. Each one was thick with cash, thousands of dollars. A fortune even for these professionals living in the diaspora. The room fell silent. Chuck's Judeo, Ngozi, and Ibrahim stared at the envelopes, the weight of the decision hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Chuck's Judeo was the first to speak, his voice tense. You think money can buy us? That we'd turn our backs on everything we've fought for just because you wave some cash in front of us? Bayo raised an eyebrow, his tone unfazed. This isn't just about money, Chuck's Judeo, it's about power, influence, the chance to shape the future of Mughal. You can either be on the winning side, or you can be left behind with a movement that's destined to crumble. Ngozi shook her head, her voice firm. The Iguarians aren't going to crumble. We've built something real, something that can change Mughal. We don't need your money. Don't be naive, Bayo replied, his tone sharp now. Do you really think the Iguarians can win without knowing what they're up against? Without understanding the forces working against them? This movement has no leader, no structure. It's a ticking time bomb, and when it explodes, where will you be? Buried in the rubble or standing tall with the ones who saw the truth? Ibrahim, who had been silent up until now, spoke quietly. And what if we say no? Bayo's smile faded. You won't be saying no. There was a long, uncomfortable pause. The 3 activists exchanged glances, the weight of Bayo's words sinking in. Refusing wasn't just a rejection of money, it was a rejection of power, protection, and security. And it was clear that there would be consequences for saying no. Chuck's Judeo was the first to stand, his jaw clenched in defiance. We're not for sale, he said, his voice cold. You can take your money and shove it. Ngozi followed suit, standing beside him. We're Iguarians, and we believe in what we're fighting for. We're not turning our backs on that. Ibrahim hesitated. His eyes flickered to the envelope in front of him, the temptation written across his face. But after a moment, he too stood, his resolve firm. We won't betray our people. Bayo's smile returned, but this time it was cold, calculating. Very well, he said softly, but I promise you, this isn't over. You may think you can walk away from this, but you'll find that the world doesn't work that way. Sooner or later you'll realize that you're on the wrong side of history. He gestured toward the door, his voice filled with an eerie calm. You can go now. Without another word, the 3 activists turned and left the room, their hearts pounding, their minds racing. They had made their choice, but they knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. What Chuck's Judeo, Ngozi, and Ibrahim didn't know was that not all the Iguarians were as principled. In the days that followed, 3 other prominent members of the movement, individuals less visible but highly connected, took Bayo's offer. They accepted the money, the promise of power, and the task of infiltrating the Iguarian ranks. With Bayo's financial backing, these newly turned insiders began to fight their way to prominence within the movement. They gained the trust of key figures, attended private strategy meetings, and slowly worked their way into the inner circles of the diaspora and local Iguarian leadership. They provided Bayo with valuable intel, details about the movement's plans, the most influential voices, and the wealthy benefactors quietly supporting the campaign. The information flowed steadily, each detail feeding into the power brokers' broader strategy. Through their efforts, the power brokers were able to identify the most cerebral members of the Iguarians, the thinkers, the planners, the ones who posed the greatest threat. Armed with this knowledge, Bayo and his associates passed the information to both the secret police and the hired thugs who had been tasked with dismantling the movement. As the information spread, the Iguarian movement found itself increasingly under pressure. Prominent members were arrested on false charges. their social media accounts hacked and flooded with disinformation. Protests were disrupted by violent provocateurs, while the leadership struggled to maintain control over a movement that seemed to be unraveling from the inside. The infiltration had begun, and the first cracks were starting to show. The financial sabotage plan was not born out of sudden inspiration, but from decades of perfecting the art of strangling opposition through the very institutions designed to serve the people. The Central Bank of Mughal, the anti-money laundering agencies, and even the Mughal Drug Enforcement Agency had long been tools in the hands of the elite, wielded not to protect the nation, but to suffocate any force that dared to rise against the status quo. Now these tools were being sharpened once again, this time to dismantle the growing threat of the agrarian movement. Chief Bisola Elenian had overseen the beginnings of the strategy. After the infiltration began to take effect, it was time to financially cripple the movement that was funded by passionate, everyday Mughal and the diaspora. The power brokers knew that without money, even the most energized movements would wither and die. And so, they turned to the only force they trusted more than money itself, the institutions they controlled. In the cold, imposing boardroom of the Central Bank of Mughal, a secret meeting had been called. At the head of the table sat the central bank governor, a man whose career had been meticulously built by the very politicians who now called in their favors. Alongside him were key officials from the Mughal Anti-Money Laundering Authority and representatives from the MDEA. Their faces were stern, their instructions clear. Chief Elenian's right-hand man, Alhaji Musa Bello, entered the room, his expression uncharacteristically grim. He knew the stakes of the meeting and the power they wielded, but he also knew they had to be delicate about their approach. Financial sabotage was not just about freezing accounts or blocking transfers, it was about waging a quiet, devastating war. "Gentlemen," Alhaji Bello began, "I trust you all know why we're here. The Aguarians are receiving an alarming amount of funding from within the country and from Mughalanders abroad. These funds are being used to fuel their movement, pay for protests, and support their social media campaigns. If we allow this to continue unchecked, they will build momentum. Our task is simple: stop them from getting their hands on this money, and we stop them from running their campaign." The central bank governor nodded in agreement. "We've already flagged several suspicious accounts linked to the Aguarian fundraising efforts. With your go-ahead, we can freeze them immediately under the guise of anti-money laundering operations." Alhaji Bello smiled approvingly. "Good, do it. But we need to be careful. This can't look like a targeted attack. Make it look like a general sweep, like we're clamping down on any large influx of funds coming from outside the country." The governor leaned forward. "We'll also use the foreign exchange laws. Anyone receiving foreign currency in large amounts can be held for questioning and asked to account for every cent. If they can't, we'll seize the funds." "Perfect," Bello replied, "but that's not enough. I want these accounts blacklisted. Any attempt to move funds, even internally, must be blocked." The diaspora had been one of the most critical sources of funding for the Aguarian movement. Through GoFundMe, grassroots donations, and community fundraisers, the Mughal diaspora had managed to channel millions into the movement. This was money that the Aguarians were using to fund their rallies, pay for transportation, print campaign materials, and keep the social media campaigns alive. But the power brokers were about to slam the door shut on that money. The Mughal Anti-Money Laundering Authority had already begun tracing the paths of the largest donations. At a separate office, a team of analysts sat before computer screens, tracking every incoming dollar and mugra that flowed into accounts linked to the Aguarian movement. A man in a suit, the head of Mamla, briefed his team. "We need to scrutinize every large transfer coming in from abroad. The second we see something that looks like it's linked to the Aguarians, we flag it. Then we make life difficult for them." An analyst raised his hand. "What if the funds are clean, legitimate donations from expatriates?" The head of Mamla didn't miss a beat. "It doesn't matter. Find something wrong with it. Mislabel it. Say it's suspicious. Then block the transaction and demand a full investigation." Across the board, thousands of dollars destined for the Aguarian movement were suddenly frozen. Banks held up the transfers, citing the need for additional documentation. Those receiving the funds were forced to navigate a bureaucratic nightmare of paperwork, explanations, and endless waiting. Accounts were frozen without warning, and funds were rerouted back to their sources. Meanwhile, Aguarian leaders scrambled to figure out what was happening. "We can't access our funds," a senior organizer complained during a video call. "We've got protests planned, rallies across the country, but we can't pay for any of it if we don't get this money released." The attacks were hitting hard, but they were about to get worse. To add insult to injury, the Mugaland Drug Enforcement Agency, or MDA, had been roped into the strategy. While the Iguarians had nothing to do with drug trafficking, it was an easy narrative to sell. The power brokers didn't need evidence, they just needed to cast doubt, and the MDEA was more than willing to comply. A senior officer at MDEA had been briefed personally by Alhaji Bello. "You're going to start hearing rumors about drug money flowing into the Iguarian movement," Bello had said, a sly smile on his face. "I need you to lean into those rumors, start making noise. You don't need proof, just suspicion. Spread the word that some of their leaders are connected to the drug trade." The officer nodded, understanding exactly what was being asked of him. A few well-placed press releases, a couple of strategically timed raids, and suddenly the headlines were ablaze with stories about investigations into Iguarian leaders allegedly involved in money laundering through the drug trade. On social media, fake accounts, many of which had been set up during the infiltration phase, began amplifying the accusations. "Are the Iguarians funding their movement with drug money?" Read one tweet from a well-followed fake account. "Sources say they're being investigated by the MDEA. If this is true, it's game over for them." "Don't be fooled by the grassroots nonsense," another tweet declared. "There's big money behind the Iguarians. And it's coming from some shady places." The media, always hungry for scandal, ran with the story. News anchors discussed the possibility of drug money funding the Iguarians, and pundits debated whether the movement was as pure as it claimed to be. The accusations, though unfounded, were enough to cast a long shadow over the entire movement. Within days, the Iguarian movement was on the defensive. The headlines were damaging, but the financial sabotage was worse. Key accounts had been frozen, donations were being held up, and transfers were blocked at every turn. Organizers couldn't pay for planned rallies, and transportation for volunteers became an immediate issue. During an emergency strategy meeting, the Iguarian leaders tried to figure out how to salvage the situation. "We're being strangled," one of the leaders said angrily. "They're blocking our money from every angle. The donations from the diaspora are practically useless now. People are afraid to even send money because they don't want their accounts frozen." Ngozi, one of the activists, slammed her hand on the table. "We knew they would come after us, but this is a full-blown attack. If we can't fund our rallies, we lose momentum, and we don't have time to fight these investigations." Chuck's Judeophore, still reeling from the infiltration attempt, spoke up. "We can't let this stop us. We've come too far. If we can't rely on international donations, we'll have to mobilize the people here. We'll go back to basics. This movement was built by the people, and will survive with or without their money." But even as the words left his mouth, there was a creeping realization that the damage was already being done. The movement's financial backbone was being systematically dismantled, and they were running out of time. Back at the central bank, the power brokers monitored the fallout with satisfaction. The strategy was working, and the Iguarians were struggling to stay afloat. Alhaji Bello received a call from the central bank governor. "The accounts are frozen, the funds blocked. We've done what we needed to do," the governor said. Bello smiled. "Excellent, let them choke on it. Without money, they're just another group of angry youths shouting into the wind, and when the election comes, they'll be powerless to stop us." The financial sabotage was in full effect, and the Iguarians were starting to crumble under the weight of it. The power brokers had thrown down their gauntlet, and for the first time, the movement was at serious risk of being strangled before it could realize its full potential. The power brokers had executed their first two strategies with brutal efficiency, but now they were moving into more dangerous territory. Financial sabotage had dealt a heavy blow to the Iguarians, but it wasn't enough. The movement was still alive, and worse, it was still growing. The power brokers needed to strike at the heart of the movement's credibility and legitimacy, casting doubt not only on its leadership but on its very intentions. The plan was simple: link the Iguarians to the Okorobian separatists and their infamous leader Ogbonna Ibekwe, who had been recently abducted in South Africa and extradited to Mugaland on charges of sedition and attempting to secede from the country. The power brokers knew that many Mugalanders feared a return to the days of civil unrest, and by associating the Iguarians with the volatile Okorobian separatist movement, they could paint the entire movement as a treasonous threat. The meeting to hatch this plot took place in the shadowy corridors of the Ministry of Justice. In attendance were senior officials from the ministry, high-ranking military officers, and key figures from the ruling political class, all of whom had one thing in common: they were terrified of the growing popularity of Paul Igwe and the Iguarians. Chief Bisola Elenian's right-hand man, Alhaji Musa Bello, stood at the head of the conference table, surveying the men and women gathered before him. They were loyalists to the system, individuals who had built their careers and fortunes on the back of Mugulan's corrupt political landscape. "We've frozen their funds and we've infiltrated their ranks," Bello began, his voice low and measured, "but the Iguarians are still standing, and as long as they continue to rally the youth, we are not safe. We must now move to the next phase, the sedition trap." The military general sitting to his left, General Okonkwo, raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about branding them as traitors, aren't you?" Bello nodded. "Precisely. We will tie them to the Okorobian separatists. The people already fear another civil war, and if we can convince them that the Iguarians are just a front for the Okorobians, we can destroy their movement in one stroke. But they've never had any known contact with Ogbonna Ibekwe, or the separatists," one of the Justice Ministry officials interjected. "Most of the Iguarians are actually against secession." Bello smiled coldly. "Facts don't matter here. Perception does. If we can make the public believe that the Iguarians are working with the Okorobians, it won't matter what the truth is. All we need is the accusation, and we have the means to back it up." The room fell silent as the weight of Bello's words settled in. They were about to accuse an entire movement of treason, knowing full well that the charges were false. But in the world of Muguland politics, such tactics were nothing new. The next morning, Muguland woke up to a storm of headlines. The state-controlled media had gone into overdrive, reporting on new developments linking the Iguarians to the Okorobian separatists. The front pages of newspapers carried sensationalist headlines: "Iguarians are separatists." "New evidence links Paul Igwe's supporters to secession plot." "Sedition charges loom for Iguarian leaders as government probes Okorobian ties." "Okorobian leaders' arrest sparks questions about Iguarian involvement in secession plan." The accusations were vague, built on nothing but rumors and carefully planted disinformation. The media reports suggested that several prominent Iguarians had been seen meeting with individuals linked to the Okorobian separatist movement, hinting at a larger conspiracy to destabilize the country ahead of the election. None of the reports offered any concrete evidence, but they didn't need to. The damage had already begun. The story was amplified on social media, where fake accounts created by the power brokers during the infiltration phase began spreading false information at an alarming rate. Videos claiming to show secret meetings between Iguarians and Okorobian leaders were doctored and shared across platforms, while memes depicting Paul Igwe as a puppet of the Okorobians flooded the internet. "Paul Igwe is nothing but a front for the Okorobians," one fake account tweeted, garnering thousands of retweets. "They want to tear this country apart, just like Ibekwe. #Iguarians for treason." Look at the real agenda of the Iguarians. They're not about change, they're about chaos and secession. Read another post, accompanied by a photoshopped image of Paul Igwe shaking hands with Ogbonna Ibekwe. The disinformation campaign was brutal, and it worked. The public response was immediate and intense. Muguland had been scarred by civil war in the past, and the thought of another secessionist movement sent waves of fear through the populace. People who had once supported the Iguarians began to question their motives, wondering if there was truth to the accusations. In one of the Iguarian cells in Alaye City, an emergency meeting was called to address the crisis. Chinedu Ebubedike Ngozi and Aga Adichie, known as Aga Warrior, sat around a table, their faces grim. "They're calling us separatists," Ngozi said, her voice shaking with anger. "They're saying we're in league with the Okorobians. This is insane. They're trying to discredit us," Aga Warrior growled, his fists clenched. "They know we have no ties to the Okorobians, but they also know that the public is scared. They're using that fear to turn people against us." Chinedu Ebubedike slammed his hand on the table. "We need to push back. We need to make it clear that we're not working with Ibekwe or any separatists. We need to show the public that we're about unity, not division." Ngozi nodded, but her expression was filled with doubt. "How? The media is already on their side. They're flooding the airwaves with lies. How do we fight back against that?" As the Iguarians scrambled to contain the fallout, the power brokers moved to the next phase of their plan. The Justice Ministry had already prepared a list of key Iguarian leaders who would be arrested on charges of sedition. These were the loudest voices within the movement, the ones who had become symbols of the fight for change. The first arrest came at dawn. The police, acting on orders from the Ministry of Justice, stormed the house of one of the movement's most vocal leaders, Chukwudifu Iwubiko, dragging him out in handcuffs as his family watched in horror. Chukwudifu Iwubiko has been arrested on charges of sedition and conspiracy to commit treason, the news anchor declared, her voice solemn. Authorities allege that he has been in contact with Okorobian separatists and has been plotting to destabilize the country in the lead-up to the election. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Iguarian movement. Chukwudifu was one of their most respected leaders, and now he was being branded a traitor. The message was clear. Anyone associated with the movement was now a target. By the end of the day, 5 more prominent Iguarians had been arrested, each charged with sedition. Their homes were raided, their personal belongings seized, and their names dragged through the mud in the media. The arrests were accompanied by staged press conferences where government officials spoke gravely about the threat posed by the Iguarians. These individuals have been involved in a plot to destabilize our beloved Mugaland, one government spokesman declared. Their ties to separatist movements have been uncovered, and they will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Despite the mounting pressure, the Iguarians refused to go quietly. On social media, they fought back against the accusations, sharing messages of unity and condemning the false claims of sedition. "We are not separatists," one post declared. "We are Mugalanders who believe in a united future for our country. Don't be fooled by their lies." #Iguarians for Change. Paul Igwe himself took to the airwaves, granting an interview to Sunset Television, one of the few media outlets that had not been fully corrupted by the power brokers. "I want to make one thing clear," Igwe said, his voice steady but firm. "The Iguarian movement has nothing to do with separatism or sedition. We are not here to divide Mugaland. We are here to unite it. These accusations are false, and they are designed to distract from the real issues. The people of Mugaland deserve better than this." But even as Igwe spoke, the damage had been done. The sedition trap had been set, and the Iguarians were now fighting not only for their candidate but for their very survival. In a private office at the Ministry of Justice, Alhaji Bello sat back in his chair, watching the fallout with satisfaction. The arrests had sent a clear message, and the accusations of treason had shaken the movement to its core. "They're scrambling now," he said, speaking to Chief Elenian over the phone. "The public doesn't know what to believe. Some still support them, but a lot of people are afraid. The seeds of doubt have been planted." Elenian's voice crackled on the other end of the line. "Good. Let them fight against their own reputation. By the time we're done with them, no one will remember what they stood for in the first place." The sedition strategy had been executed perfectly. The Iguarians were under siege, and with each passing day, their credibility was being eroded. The power brokers had managed to turn the tide against them, using fear and lies to paint them as enemies of the state. And as the election drew closer, the Iguarians faced an increasingly uncertain future.
The power brokers had woven a web of lies, infiltrated the ranks of the Iguarians, and used the full weight of financial institutions to choke the movement's resources. They had accused the Iguarians of sedition, painting them as traitors in the court of public opinion. But these strategies, as damaging as they were, still hadn't crushed the movement entirely. The Iguarians were resilient, they adapted, they fought back. It was time for the final phase of the power brokers' plan: direct intimidation and violence. This was the most dangerous of the 5 strategies, a method that had been used before by the corrupt elites in Mugaland, but always with caution. They knew that violence could either silence dissent or make martyrs of the opposition, fueling the very cause they sought to destroy. But Chief Bisolo Elenian and his cohort were running out of patience. The election was fast approaching, and the Iguarians were still a threat. Time for subtlety has passed. Elenian had said in a meeting just days before, "We need to send a message, loud and clear." The first act of violence was strategic. Gabby Tolbearer, one of the most vocal Iguarian organizers and a youth leader with immense popularity, had been targeted for weeks. His fiery speeches on Twitter Spaces and rallies had inspired thousands, and his grassroots leadership had made him a symbol of the movement's indomitable spirit. If the power brokers could break Gabby, they believed they could break the movement. On a quiet evening in LA City, Gabby was out with his wife and a few friends at Onidodo Beach, enjoying the calm before the storm of election week. It was supposed to be a peaceful night, but the power brokers had other plans. Suddenly, a convoy of black SUVs appeared, screeching to a halt on the sand. Armed men in dark suits and military-grade gear poured out of the vehicles, surrounding Gabby and his group. The beachgoers looked on in horror as the men roughly grabbed Gabby, pulling him away from his wife, who screamed and pleaded for mercy. "You're under arrest. You're wanted for possession of illegal firearms." Gabby's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? Firearms? I don't own any guns." His car was searched, and conveniently several loaded guns were discovered in the trunk, neatly planted by Marufu Ika, a notorious street thug on the payroll of Chief Bisola Elenian. Gabby protested, demanding proof, but it didn't matter. He was handcuffed, shoved into the back of the SUV, and driven away as his wife collapsed to the ground in tears. Word spread quickly. Gabby Tollbearer had been arrested on charges of illegal gun possession, a crime that carried the death penalty in Mugaland. The news sent shockwaves through the Iguerian movement. Gabby's friends and fellow activists knew the charges were false, but they also knew how dangerous it was to fight the system. This was a message, a warning to all Iguerians: you could be next. Gabby was taken to a dark, undisclosed police detention center where the real nightmare began. In the cold concrete cell, he was beaten mercilessly by thugs planted within the police force. They took turns laughing and taunting him as they delivered blow after blow, bruising his body, breaking his spirit. "You think you're a hero?" One of the thugs spat, kicking Gabby in the ribs. "You think your Iguerians will save you?" Another thug slapped him across the face. "This is what happens when you go up against the powers that run this country. Your people can tweet all they want, but at the end of the day, they can't protect you." For hours, Gabby was tortured. By the time the thugs were done, he was a broken man, his body covered in cuts and bruises, his face swollen beyond recognition. And all the while, they whispered threats in his ear. "Your wife, she'll be next. Your friends, they'll disappear too." This is just the beginning. But what the power brokers hadn't counted on was the solidarity of the Iguerians. The moment news of Gabby's arrest and brutal treatment spread, the Iguerians mobilized with a fury that took even the government by surprise. Within hours, Twitter spaces were flooded with discussions about Gabby's plight. The hashtag #FreeGabby began trending, and soon the entire nation was talking about his arrest. The Iguerians knew they couldn't fight the power brokers with violence, but they had their own weapons: social media, unity, and the unstoppable force of public opinion. In less than a day, 2 senior advocates of Mugaland, Sands, volunteered to represent Gabby, and legal teams were dispatched to the detention center where he was being held. Iguerians across the country raised over 5 million mugra in defense funds through Twitter and other platforms, and donations kept pouring in. Even those who had once been skeptical of the movement rallied to support Gabby. The pressure mounted as journalists and activists began to call for his release, shining a spotlight on the government's brutal tactics. Videos of his family pleading for his release went viral, and soon the international community began to take notice. But it wasn't just legal and financial support that the Iguerians provided. Small businesses run by Iguerians stepped in to help Gabby's wife and children, delivering food, offering assistance, and running his affairs while he was detained. The message was clear: the Iguerians took care of their own. As the movement around Gabby grew, the power brokers began to panic. They hadn't expected this level of backlash. Gabby's arrest was supposed to scare the Iguerians into submission, but instead it had emboldened them. And then came a twist that the power brokers hadn't foreseen. Oba Orisa, one of the most respected traditional rulers in Mugaland, had heard of Gabby's arrest. Though he wasn't involved in politics, Oba Orisa was known for his influence and deep connections in the corridors of power. He was also a firm believer in justice, and he had seen enough of the corruption plaguing his country. Using his considerable influence, Oba Orisa quietly reached out to his contacts in the judiciary and the police force. He demanded an investigation into the charges against Gabby, and though the government tried to resist, the pressure was too much. Oba Orisa's word carried weight, and no one dared to openly defy him. Within days, the trumped-up charges against Gabby were dropped, and he was released from detention, beaten and bloodied, but alive. When Gabby emerged from the detention center, his face swollen and bruised, the Iguarians erupted in celebration. Social media exploded with messages of support, and #GabbyIsFree began trending within minutes. But this was not just a victory for Gabby. It was a victory for the entire Iguarian movement. On Twitter Spaces, Gabby's release became a rallying cry. The Iguarians had stood their ground, and they had won. They knew now that the power brokers were willing to use violence, but they also knew they weren't alone. "They can't break us," one Iguarian activist said during a broadcast. "They thought that arresting Gabby would scare us, but it's only made us stronger. We will fight for every single one of us, and we will not back down." Back in Buja Metropolis, the power brokers were meeting once again, but this time the mood was different. Chief Elenian sat at the head of the table, his face twisted with frustration. The intimidation had backfired. "This was supposed to send a message," Elenian roared, slamming his fist on the table. "Instead, we've made him a hero. They're stronger than ever." Alhaji Bello, always the calm voice of reason, spoke up. "It's a temporary setback, Chief. The movement is still vulnerable. We may not have broken them, but we've shown them what we're capable of. We just need to be more strategic in our next moves." But Elenian wasn't convinced. "We need to show more force. If one arrest isn't enough, we'll arrest 10 more. We'll make them all fear for their lives." Bello nodded slowly. "Yes, but we need to be careful. Too much violence and they'll become martyrs. We must use the right amount of fear, just enough to make them think twice before challenging us again." The power brokers knew that the violence had only just begun. The direct intimidation and violence strategy had sent a message, but the Iguarians were proving harder to crush than they had anticipated. They would need to escalate the brutality, and soon. Despite the violence, despite the intimidation, the Iguarians stood firm. Gabby's story became a symbol of the movement's resilience. They knew that more arrests would come, that the power brokers were not done with their campaign of fear. But they also knew something else. They were not alone. The Iguarians had tasted victory, and no amount of violence would make them forget it. Episode 22, The Subtle Betrayal Co-opting Influential Voices. By now, the power brokers had unleashed a series of devastating blows on the Iguarian movement. They had frozen their finances, accused them of sedition, and used brutal intimidation tactics to break their resolve. But the Iguarians, despite everything, had proven resilient, a force that refused to crumble under pressure. With the election just days away, Chief Bisola Elenian and his inner circle knew they needed a more insidious strategy, one that would shake the movement from within without the overt violence that could turn public opinion against them. It was time for the fifth and final strategy co-opting influential voices. The plan was subtle but deadly. Rather than continuing the direct assault, the power brokers would turn to public figures, popular youth influencers, and respected commentators on social media who had earned the trust of the masses. These voices would pretend to share the same ideals as the Iguarians, but their real purpose was to sow doubt, undermine morale, and discredit the movement by amplifying every misstep. It was a quiet betrayal, one designed to cause confusion and chaos among the ranks of the Iguarians. The targeted recruitment. The power brokers knew exactly who to approach. They needed influencers with large followings, people who were trusted by the youth, and had built a reputation for being politically neutral or outspoken against corruption. These were individuals who could appear to remain on the side of change while subtly pushing a narrative that would weaken the Iguarians from within. In a private office in the heart of Buja Metropolis, Alhaji Musa Bello met with 3 such individuals: Tokunbo TK Adewale, a social media personality known for his biting commentary on politics; Funmi Bankole, a prominent lifestyle influencer with millions of followers on Instagram and Twitter; and Ifeanyi Nnamdi, a respected journalist who had built a reputation for being a voice of reason in the political sphere. The meeting was casual, but the stakes were high. Drinks were poured, pleasantries exchanged, and then the real conversation began. Alhaji Bello leaned forward, his voice calm but purposeful. "You 3 have built an immense following," he said, his eyes scanning their faces. "You've earned the trust of the people. That's exactly why we need you. The Iguarians are on the rise, but they're not what they seem. We believe they are not about change. They are about chaos. We need to show the people that." TK raised an eyebrow. "Chaos? The Iguarians are pushing for better governance. They're calling for transparency, accountability. How is that chaos?" Bello smiled, his tone shifting to one of quiet persuasion. It's not about what they say on the surface, it's about what they do. Look at their online presence, aggressive, uncompromising, attacking anyone who disagrees with them. They're no better than the politicians they claim to fight against. They're radicals, and radicals don't build nations, they burn them down. Funme sipped her drink, clearly intrigued. So, what exactly are you asking us to do? Bello's smile widened. That we need you to be the voice of reason. Speak out against the extremism in the Iguerian movement. You don't have to attack Paul Igwe directly, that would be too obvious. Instead, point out the chaos within the movement, amplify their mistakes. Every time an Iguerian member says something controversial, blow it up. Make people question if this movement is really about change or just about tearing the country apart. Ifeanyi, the journalist, frowned. And what do we get out of this? Bello didn't hesitate. Influence, power, money, of course. But more than that, you'll be seen as the voices of reason. When this all blows over, the government will owe you favors. You'll be able to shape the political landscape of Muguland for years to come. When the dust settles, you'll be the ones people turn to. There was a long pause as the three influencers exchanged glances. They knew what was being asked of them. It wasn't just about voicing an opinion, it was about manipulating public perception, undermining a movement that had garnered widespread support. But the rewards were tempting. Fame, money, and political favor were powerful motivators. The betrayal begins. Within days, the plan was set in motion. On Twitter, TK began to tweet a series of cryptic messages aimed at the Iguerians. At first, they were subtle, casting doubt on the movement's ability to lead. Change is good, one of TK's tweets read, but chaos in the name of change. That's dangerous. #think twice, another tweet followed. Revolution isn't just about tearing down, it's about building. Do the Iguerians know how to build, or are they just angry? Just asking. These tweets were liked and retweeted by thousands of his followers, many of whom began to echo his sentiment. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. Where once the Iguerians had been seen as a force for positive change, whispers of their supposed recklessness and instability began to surface. Funmi too played her part. On Instagram, she posted videos and stories about the need for calm, measured leadership and how emotional reactions to politics can be dangerous. Her posts were carefully crafted, never directly attacking the Iguerians, but subtly reinforcing the idea that the movement was too emotional, too erratic to be trusted. Ifeanyi, the journalist, took a more direct approach. In an article published on a major news platform, he praised Paul Igwe's vision, but questioned the movement's tactics. While the Iguerians have noble goals, he wrote, their increasingly aggressive approach raises concerns about their ability to govern. A nation cannot be led by those who only know how to tear down. It must be led by those who know how to build bridges. The article sparked debate across the country. Iguerians were furious, calling Ifeanyi a sellout and accusing him of being in the pockets of the elites. But the damage was done. The more the Iguerians lashed out, the more the narrative of their instability grew, amplifying the mistakes. The power brokers had given these influencers more than just a platform. They had given them ammunition. Through their network of infiltrators within the Iguerian movement, they fed Funmi, TK, and Ifeanyi every misstep, every controversial statement made by Iguerian members. And the influencers did what they did best. They amplified those mistakes. When an overzealous Iguerian member posted an inflammatory tweet calling for a reckoning against corrupt politicians, TK retweeted it with the comment, "Is this what change looks like? Violence and threats not the way." When a protest turned chaotic after a small group of agitators, planted by the power brokers, caused a disruption, Funmi posted a video of the incident, captioning it, "This isn't peaceful protest, this is madness. We need leadership, not mob rule." And when a prominent Iguerian organizer made a poorly worded statement in an interview suggesting that the movement would bring down the system, Ifeanyi wrote a scathing editorial questioning whether the Iguerians understood the consequences of their rhetoric. "These are dangerous words," he wrote. "The system may be broken, but do the Iguerians have a plan to fix it, or are they simply intent on burning it all down?" The narrative was shifting. Slowly but surely, the public began to question the Iguerians' ability to lead. Were they truly the answer to Muguland's problems, or were they just a group of angry youths who didn't understand the complexities of governance? The Iguerians fight back. But the Iguerians were not blind to what was happening. They knew they were being attacked on multiple fronts, and they fought back with everything they had. On social media, they called out the influencers, accusing them of being bought by the establishment. Hashtags like #sellouttk and #fakefunmi trended for days as Iguerians exposed the connections between these influencers and the power brokers behind the scenes. Paul Igwe himself took to Twitter to address the growing narrative. "Do not be fooled," he tweeted. "The voices calling for calm are the same voices that have kept Mugaland in chains for decades. They fear change because they know that real change will mean the end of their power." #Iguerians unite. But despite their best efforts, the damage was done. The influencers had sown the seeds of doubt, and while many still supported the Iguerians, others began to waver. The movement that had once been so united now found itself fractured, with internal debates about strategy and leadership growing more heated by the day. The power brokers' quiet victory. In a private meeting back in Buja metropolis, Alhaji Bello reported the success of the co-opting strategy to Chief Elenian. "The influencers are doing their job," Bello said with satisfaction. "The Iguerians are losing credibility. They're fighting among themselves now, questioning their own leadership." Elenian smiled. "Good. Let them tear themselves apart. The less we have to do, the better." The power brokers had played their final card, and it was working. While the Iguerians still had the passion and the numbers, their unity had been shaken. The influencers, carefully chosen for their credibility and reach, had done what no amount of violence or financial sabotage could accomplish. They had planted the seeds of doubt within the movement itself. And as the election drew near, the Iguerians were no longer just fighting the elites, they were fighting themselves.
They call us reckless, they call us wild, but we're the voice of the unheard child. For too long we've watched them steal and deceive. Now we march, 'cause in hope we believe. Locked up in chains, they try to make us fall, but we stand tall, we're answering the call. Persecuted, but we won't. They call us reckless, they call us wild, but we're the voice of the unheard child. For too long we've watched them steal and deceive. Now we march, 'cause in hope we believe. Locked up in chains, they try to make us fall, but we stand tall, we're answering the call. Persecuted, but we won't be tamed. For Mugaland's freedom, our fire's inflamed. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbowed, unbroken by the lights. With Mugaland in our hearts, we rise, we rise. The streets are burning with the passion of the brave. No chains can hold us, no power can enslave. They say we're rebels, but we know we're right. Corruption crumbles when we unite. On social media, in the open streets, our voices thunder, refusing defeat. They throw us in cells, accuse us of treason, but we keep fighting, for we are the reason. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbowed, unbroken by the lights. With Mugaland in our hearts, we rise, we rise. We fight for the future, we fight for the land. With hearts full of fire, we make our stand. They can't break our spirits, they can't make us fall. In the name of Mugaland, we answer the call. We are the children of anger, fighting for the truth. Born from love for our land, the fire of the youth. We stand unbound, unbroken by the lights. With Mugaland in our hearts, we rise, we rise. We are the anger, we are the flame. For the love of Mugaland, we'll fight in her name. With unyielding hearts, we'll carry the fight. In the dark of corruption, we'll be the light.